Every hike begins with the hope of making it back safely, but not every influencer does. Join me as I go through some of the worst influencer hiking deaths ever recorded. From a creator who mocked a veteran park ranger's life-saving warning before walking into record-breaking Death Valley heat, to others who trusted satellite maps, AI, and viral content over basic survival, only to discover that the desert doesn't care how many followers you have.
It was July 10th, 2021, and the thermometer outside the visitor center at Furnace Creek had already cleared 117 degrees before lunch. Death Valley was in the middle of the kind of heat wave that makes the national news. The week the official gauge would touch 130, one of the highest temperatures ever reliably recorded anywhere on the planet. To put that in perspective, a normal oven set to keep food warm sits not far above that. The parking lot at the Golden Canyon trailhead shimmered like there was water on it. Most people who pulled in took one step out of their air conditioning, felt the air hit them like an open oven door, and got right back in their cars to go find a viewpoint they could enjoy through a windshield. The radio that morning was full of heat warnings, the kind that tell people to stay indoors, check on elderly neighbors, and never leave anyone sitting in a parked car. And the whole region was bracing for a day that would break records. One of them did not. Her name was Liana Marchetti, 28 years old, and to thousands of people online, she was a full-time adventure influencer. Her whole brand was being the fearless one, the girl who did the thing everyone else was too scared or too sensible to do, and she had the numbers to prove that people loved watching it. She had built that following over years, one bigger risk at a time, swimming in places with signs that said "do not swim," climbing things that were roped off, walking up to wild animals other people backed away from. The trouble with a brand like that is that it has to keep escalating. An audience that follows you because you are fearless gets bored the moment you start looking careful, and Liana knew it. Every video had to be a little bolder than the last one, a little closer to a line, and the comments rewarded her every time she leaned further out over the edge. She had come to Death Valley in the worst week of the entire summer on purpose, because heat that made the news made for views, and a video of her conquering the hottest place on Earth in record temperatures was exactly the kind of thing her audience showed up for. She had the whole video planned in her head before she ever left the car. The dramatic walk into the canyon, the harsh light, a piece to camera at the top about pushing past your limits, and a caption about doing the thing everyone swore was impossible. It was going to be one of her best, the kind of post that pulls in a wave of new followers and a flood of comments calling her a legend. In a strange way, the ranger had handed her a gift, because now the video had a villain to wave off at the start, a perfect little setup for the triumph she was certain was waiting at the end. Here's the thing you have to understand about how she saw a place like this. To Liana, a warning was not a warning, it was a setup for a better video. The scarier something sounded, the better the story when she walked away from it, smiling, unbothered, proven right. She had spent years training her audience to expect exactly that, and she had spent those same years quietly training herself to ignore the part of her brain that was supposed to be afraid. By the time she got to Death Valley, that part of her had been overruled so many times that it had basically stopped speaking up. I've seen her type before, the kind who built a brand on ignoring advice, so to her, a ranger saying no was just more content. Death Valley is not dangerous the way a cliff is dangerous, where you can see the edge and respect it. It kills you quietly, through a number on a thermometer that does not look like it should be able to hurt you. There is no claw, no fall, no single dramatic moment, just heat, steady and patient and absolutely without mercy. That is exactly what makes it so deadly, because a threat you cannot see and cannot feel sneaking up on you is a threat that is very easy to underestimate right up until the point where it is far too late to do anything about it. In heat like that, your body is in a fight from the second you step outside. You sweat out water faster than you could ever drink it back, and because the desert air is so dry, the sweat evaporates off your skin almost the instant it appears, so you often cannot even see that you are drenched and emptying out. The official temperature is always measured in the shade. Out in the open, on dark rock, in direct sun, the real temperature against your body runs far higher than whatever number the sign in the parking lot shows. People walk out into that believing the sign, never understanding that the sign was describing the easiest version of where they were going. By the time most people understand that difference, they are already deep into the canyon, already low on water, and already feeling a little off in a way they cannot quite put a name to. Death Valley kills people every single year, and the ones it kills are almost always the ones who came to look at it rather than to survive it. Tourists step out for a quick photo and go down within sight of the road. Hikers underestimate a short trail and never climb back out of it. The rangers will tell you the same thing over and over, that the desert does not care how fit you are or how many hard things you have done somewhere cooler. Fitness buys you a little extra time out here and absolutely nothing more. What actually keeps you alive is respect, water, and the sense to be shaded and still when the sun is at its worst. I tell people Death Valley in July is not a desert, it's a furnace with a parking lot. The hike she had picked was the Golden Canyon Loop, a route that climbs up through a maze of golden and red rock toward the famous overlook at Zabriskie Point and comes back down through a wash called Gower Gulch. In the cool months, it is one of the most beautiful and popular day hikes in the entire park, busy with families and photographers. In July, it is a different thing wearing the same name. There is no water anywhere on it, none, and there is no shade either, not a single tree, not one reliable overhang, just bare rock that drinks the sun all day and throws it back at you from every direction at once. The Badlands have one more trick to them, and it is the one that turns a heat emergency into a death. They look identical in every direction. The same bleached gold walls, the same dry folds and ridges, narrow side canyons branching off the main route like hallways in a building with no signs and no numbers on the doors. With a clear head and a marked trail, it is a wonderful place to wander. With a cooking brain and no landmarks, it is a trap that closes so softly you do not even hear it shut behind you. Search teams have pulled people out of those exact side canyons before, some of them only a short distance off the main trail, close enough that on a clear-headed day they could have walked back out in minutes. I've walked those Badlands, and there's no shade out there. Not a tree, not an overhang, just rock throwing heat back at you. The man standing near the trailhead that morning was a ranger named Cal Renfro. Cal had worked Death Valley for the better part of 30 years, and in that time he had helped carry more than a few people out of these canyons, some of them walking and shaking and lucky, and some of them not walking at all. Summer was the season he hated, because summer was when people came from all over the world to see the famous heat, treating a killer like a tourist attraction, and a certain number of them every single year decided that the warnings were meant for somebody else. He had learned over the decades to read people fast, because reading them fast was sometimes the only thing that saved them. He knew the difference between the hiker who was nervous and prepared and the hiker who was confident and carrying nothing. He knew that the dangerous ones were almost never the ones who looked scared. They were the ones who looked sure of themselves. The ones who had clearly done risky things before and gotten away with it, because getting away with it was exactly what taught them they could not be hurt. Cal spotted Liana the moment she stepped out of her car with a phone already pointed at her own face. Cal spent 30 years pulling people off that trail. When a man like that tells me to turn around, I'm back in my car before he even finishes the sentence. He did what he always did. He walked over, friendly but serious, and told her plainly that she should not attempt the loop today. He told her it was already over 115 degrees and still climbing, that the canyon would be hotter still with no air moving through it, and that people had died on easier hikes than this one, in less heat than this. He pointed at the small bottle clipped to her bag and told her that was not nearly enough water, that a hike like this in this heat needed gallons, not a bottle. He told her that if she truly meant to do it, she had to start at first light the next morning, not late on a day that was already an emergency. None of what Cal said was an opinion, and none of it was him being dramatic. It was the same message printed on the big signs all around the parking lot, the ones with the red letters that exist precisely because so many people have died doing exactly what she was about to do. The park does not send rangers out to warn people at that trailhead in a heat wave for fun. It puts them there because that specific trail, in that specific heat, has a body count, and because a friendly human voice saying "turn around" saves more lives than any sign ever has. Cal had personally turned a lot of people back over the years. Most of them, when it came down to it, listened. Liana did not listen. She turned the camera on him instead. For her followers, she narrated the whole thing as it happened. This overprotective ranger who thought a little walk was going to kill her, who so clearly did not know who he was talking to. She let him finish, thanked him with the kind of smile that was really a dismissal, and told him she would be totally fine. She did stuff like this all the time. Then she clipped her one small bottle back onto her bag, fixed her hair in the camera, and started up the trail into the canyon while he stood there and watched her her go. There was nothing he could legally do to stop a grown woman from taking a walk in a national park. She was not the only person Cal spoke to that morning, and she was not the only one who had shown up wanting to hike. The difference was that the others listened. A couple turned around right there in the lot and decided to come back at dawn instead. A young guy who had planned the very same loop took one more look at the heat shimmering off the rock, thanked the ranger, and went to find an air-conditioned diner. None of them got a video out of it, and all of them are still alive. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth about this place, that the people who leave with nothing to post are usually the ones who leave at all. I've watched that clip more than once. She rolls her eyes at Cal while he tells her people die out here. I have thought a lot about what was going through her head as she walked away from that man. I do not think she was being brave, and I do not even think she was being stupid in the way we usually mean it. I think she had simply done this exact thing so many times, ignored so many warnings, and walked away fine that the warnings had stopped carrying any weight at all. Cal was not a 30-year expert to her. He was just one more worried voice to wave off on the way to the shot she wanted. No different from a comment telling her to be careful that she would scroll right past. She started up Golden Canyon a little before 11 in the morning, which is just about the worst possible hour to begin. The early part of the trail was everything she had come for. The walls rose up around her in deep gold and rust red. The light was harsh and dramatic in a way that looks incredible on camera, and the footage she shot in that first half hour was really beautiful. She was moving easily, the trail rising only gently as it wound up into the canyon, narrating as she went, smiling, vindicated. There was no reason in those first minutes for her to feel anything but good about her choice, and that, more than anything, is how the desert gets you. Heading into those canyons at noon never feels dangerous in the moment, and that's the trick of it. I've watched the desert let people walk in. The trail drew her deeper in. She climbed up the side spur toward Red Cathedral, a towering wall of rust-colored rock that is one of the most photographed spots on the whole route, and then pushed on up toward Manly Beacon and the high point of the loop. Down in the lower canyon, the rock walls pressed in close on both sides and trapped the heat like an oven with the door shut. No breeze at all, not a breath of moving air to carry any of it away. Higher up, where the trail climbed out of the canyon and into the open badlands toward Manly Beacon, the walls fell away and took even the idea of shade with them, leaving her out under a sun that did not let up for a second. She was sweating hard now, though in that dryness she still could not see it, and she was reaching for her one bottle far more often than she had planned to. What made the first part feel so easy was also exactly what made it so dangerous, and she had no way to feel that yet. The trail climbs the whole way in, gaining hundreds of feet up through the wash and out into the open badlands toward the high ground around Manly Beacon, and the hardest, most exposed stretch of the loop was still ahead of her. Every comfortable step in the cool of the morning carried her deeper into the maze and farther from the only safety there was, her car back at the trailhead. She felt strong and capable and completely right. The desert was simply waiting for the heat of the afternoon to hand her the bill. The first part of that trail feels easy, a gentle walk up a pretty canyon. I promise you that's just the desert letting you get far from your car. By the time she reached the upper section, somewhere in the early afternoon, the temperature down in that open canyon was well past anything the visitor center sign had shown that morning. This is the part of these stories that people who have never stood in it cannot quite picture. It was not uncomfortable the way a hot day at home is uncomfortable. It was a physical force, a steady pressure leaning on her from every direction, the air itself too hot to take any heat away from her no matter how hard or fast she breathed. Her pace fell off. The filming, the entire reason she had driven out here, slowed and then mostly stopped because the heat had begun to demand everything she had just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. By the middle of the afternoon, the canyon had become something close to a kiln. The walls threw heat at her face and her back at the same time, the ground cooked up through the soles of her shoes, and the air gave her nothing to work with no matter how deeply she breathed. She had stopped filming a while ago. The bright, chatty narration of the morning was gone, replaced by the simple animal work of moving forward through air that felt like it was trying to hold her in place. She was deep into the loop now, too far along for turning back to feel obvious, and nowhere near close enough to the end for finishing to be safe. There is a cruel arithmetic to a loop trail in heat like that, where the safest choice and the fastest choice stop being the same thing, and a tired brain almost always grabs for fast. Somewhere on that upper stretch, her water ran out. The small bottle that Cal had pointed at and warned her about, the one she had clipped back on with a smile, was empty hours before she could possibly be back at her car, and there was not one more drop anywhere on that trail. From that moment, she was on a clock that could not be stopped or reset. She was losing water with every breath and every step, in temperatures that would not begin to drop until long after dark, with the hardest climbing of the loop and the long descent through Gower Gulch still standing between her and the parking lot. She carried one little designer water bottle on a hike that needed a gallon. In that heat, that bottle is not water, it's a timer. The first real trouble was almost certainly a headache and a creeping dizziness, the kind of thing that is easy to argue yourself out of for a little while when you are determined to finish. But in heat like that, the body does not give you long to negotiate. As she kept moving, her core temperature was climbing past the point a human being can survive, and the warning signs were stacking up one on top of another. The pounding head, the wave of nausea, the strange and sudden heaviness in her legs that no amount of willpower could lift. At some point, and this is one of the most dangerous moments of all, her skin would have stopped feeling sweaty and started feeling hot and dry. That is the signal that the body's entire cooling system has failed, that it has run out of water to sweat with and simply given up trying. From there, the internal temperature rises fast, and the organ that suffers first and worst is the brain. The very tool she needed most to save herself, clear and careful thinking, was the first thing the heat reached in and switched off. Heat stroke doesn't feel like just being hot. Your judgment is the first thing to go, so the moment you need to think clearly, your own brain stops helping you. And this is where the desert does its cruelest work, because once the thinking goes, everything else follows. A clear-headed person in trouble turns around and retraces their steps straight back to the trailhead they know. Liana, by every later reconstruction of what happened, did the opposite of that. Somewhere up in the maze of the upper Badlands, she left the main trail entirely, turning off into a narrow side canyon. Whether she was chasing one last shot, or convinced it was a shortcut, or simply no longer able to tell the difference. The marked loop was hard enough in that heat. Off the trail, in that terrain, she had just walked into the one place nobody searching would think to look first. Investigators believe she did try to keep going for a long while, the way determined people do, pushing through signals that should have stopped her cold. But heat does not respect determination. The very grit that had built her whole career, the refusal to quit, the certainty that she could power through anything, was now working directly against her, driving her forward and burning through her last reserves when the one thing that might have saved her was to stop, find whatever sliver of shelter existed, and wait for the cool of night. Her greatest strength had quietly turned into the thing walking her toward the edge. Those canyons all look the same inside, like a maze cut from an oven. You don't feel lost in there until you already are. The side canyons of the Badlands are a trap built for exactly this situation. They branch and fork and double back on themselves, every wall the same washed out gold as the last, and they swallow sound and phone signal alike. The phone she trusted for absolutely everything would have been useless to her by now. No service down in the rock, and a battery cooking past the point it would even turn on. She had no paper map, no compass, no extra water, and no clear idea anymore of which direction would take her back. She was wandering, slower and slower, through a place that offered her the same blank answer every way she turned. Time worked against her now, in a way she could not feel. Every minute she spent lost was a minute of water she did not have, in heat that was still climbing toward its afternoon peak. She had told no one her exact plan beyond the ranger she had laughed at. No friend was waiting at the bottom with a worried eye on the time, no partner was tracking her location on a phone, no one in the world who loved her knew precisely where she was or when she was supposed to be back. She had traded all of that away long ago for the freedom to do whatever she wanted, and out here that freedom had nothing left to give her. What followed was slow and disoriented, and, from the outside, almost quiet. She moved through the side canyons with no real direction, the walls all the same, the sun straight overhead and then sliding west, every turn looking like a way out and ending in more rock. She had no shade to rest in and no water to wait on. The smart move, if any move was still smart by then, was to stop and conserve. But a confused, overheating brain rarely makes the smart move, and hers was already past making much of any decision at all. Even if she had somehow been able to call for help, the rescue most people quietly assume is always waiting was not a sure thing on a day like that one. Helicopters do not fly the same in extreme heat, because the thin, superheated air gives the rotor blades far less to grab onto, and operations in the worst of the afternoon get much harder and sometimes get grounded entirely. The people who could have come for her, with no idea she was in trouble, no idea she had left the route hours ago, and no way to reach the fold of Badlands she had wandered into even if somehow they had known to try. Everybody out there is quietly counting on a helicopter. In that heat, the air gets too thin for the rotors to lift, and That's a bet I would never make. Heat stroke, once it truly takes hold, moves through the body in stages, and not one of them can be willed away by wanting it badly enough. The confusion deepens into something close to drunkenness. Coordination goes so that walking a straight line becomes impossible. As the core temperature keeps climbing, the organs begin to fail in sequence, and the overheating brain shuts down its higher functions one by one, the way a building powers down floor by floor. A person that far gone stops being able to make a plan, then stops being able to stand, and finally stops being able to do anything at all but sit down where they are. There is a moment where your legs simply stop listening. You are awake, you are scared, and your body has already decided it is finished. Eventually, her body did the deciding for her. The walking slowed to a stagger, the stagger to a few steps at a time, and then to nothing. Somewhere up that dead-end wash, she sat down in the only patch of ground she could reach, and she did not get up again. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing like the movies, just a strong young woman quietly running out of everything a person needs to stay alive in a place that had been trying to tell her exactly that since the moment she stepped out of her car. The desert did not cool off anywhere near fast enough to save her. Even after the sun finally dropped behind the ridgelines, the rock held the day's heat for hours and kept breathing it back out into the dark, and by then, the damage inside her was long past undoing. She was off any trail. A searcher would walk in the dark, tucked up a sidewash in the Badlands with a dead phone and an empty bottle, in a silence so total that most people will never experience anything like it in their lives. All those followers, all that constant noise that had filled every single day of her adult life, and there was not another person anywhere near her in that black stretch of desert. Thousands of people watched her that week, and she died with not one of them within 50 miles of her. The desert never once cared how many followers she had. Liana Marchetti died that night in a side canyon of the Golden Canyon Badlands of hyperthermia, her body finally overwhelmed by a heat it was never built to withstand, only a handful of hours after she had smiled into her own camera and waved off the one man who tried to save her life. She had come to the hottest place on Earth to prove that she could beat it, in the worst week anyone had ever picked to try, and the desert did to her exactly what the ranger had said it would, on very nearly the timeline he had laid out. She was never going to win that fight. She had walked away from her one real chance of surviving it. The moment she walked away from him, her rental car sat alone in the Golden Canyon lot through the evening and deep into the night. She had come to the park by herself, with no one expecting her anywhere, so there was no worried phone call to start things sooner, just that one car that never left. In a heat wave like that, rangers keep an eye on the popular trailheads, and when the car was still there long after dark, the Park Service knew someone had gone in and not come out. At first light the next morning, they began to look. It still took them well into the morning to find her, off the marked loop, up a dead-end sidewash she never should have entered. The Inyo County coroner ruled the cause of death as hyperthermia, heat stroke, the very thing the signs in that parking lot warn about in big red letters, the very thing Cal Renfro had stood there and told her to her face. On the phone recovered with her body, investigators found all of it: the gorgeous Golden Canyon, the bright, confident narration, and near the very beginning, the clip of a park ranger calmly trying to talk her out of the exact hike that ended up killing her. She had filmed her own warning, she had filmed herself laughing it off. And the thousands of people who had spent years cheering her on for being fearless were left to sit with what fearless had finally cost. Cal told her face to face how this would end, and she filmed it for laughs. He drove home that night safely. Meanwhile, she lost her life in one of the most brutal ways possible. It was June 22nd, 2013, in Death Valley National Park. The Badlands there are a maze of clay ridges and gullies. From above, it can look flat and harmless, especially in satellite images, but on the ground, it's very different. Everything reflects heat, and the pale rock just throws it right back at you. It builds fast, and it gets intense. Meilani Cosley, she was 26, a travel and lifestyle creator based in Phoenix. She was really into desert photography, that off-grid, hidden place kind of aesthetic. Her boyfriend, Jovan Thill, 29, sometimes helped her film, but he didn't have much experience in extreme environments like that, especially not dry desert heat like Death Valley. A few weeks before the trip, Meilani finds a drone clip online of the Badlands and assumes it's something remote, like a proper backcountry hike. But in reality, it wasn't. It was shot near a roadside pullout, just a short walk from the car. I get why that mistake happens, because from above, everything in that terrain can look way more isolated than it actually is. Still, she treats it like this hidden, untouched landscape. She lines up a small sponsorship for a shoot, planning it around that golden hour light. And she doesn't really check in with park staff or fully take in just how extreme the heat can get there. This is why I start thinking about how often people underestimate just how aggressive that heat gets. On arrival, they carried minimal water and entered the terrain in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. What appeared as open ground quickly broke into steep gullies and narrow clay ridges, forcing repeated detours. Navigation based on a saved satellite image soon became unreliable due to a lack of stable reference points. As they moved deeper into the Badlands, the environment shifted from difficult to disorienting. Gullies deepened into narrow channels that required constant climbing, descending, and backtracking. Their position relative to the road became increasingly uncertain. Water supplies declined faster than anticipated, while early heat strain began to affect both individuals, marked by fatigue, reduced coordination, and slowed decision-making. By the middle of the afternoon, they reach what they think is the right ridge, but it's not. It's a smaller outcrop, still a few hundred meters short of their goal. From there, things get more serious. A drop-off, then more exposed terrain that's rough even in normal conditions, and worse in that heat. By this point, they're already running low on water, not just a bit low, but critical. I'll be honest, seeing how little water they had here changes how I read everything that follows. The ground is also just soaking up heat and throwing it back up, making everything feel even worse. This is where Meilani decides to keep going instead of turning back to the road, thinking they're close enough to finish. But that choice keeps them out longer, more climbing, more exposure, less water, and heat stress that keeps building without easing. Phil began to show clear signs of heat exhaustion, including headache, nausea, and diminished sweating. Meilani attempted to manage their remaining water, but physiological decline was already underway. Within a short period, Phil's condition progressed to heat stroke, marked by confusion and loss of coherent speech. Meilani attempted to reverse course toward the road, but the terrain no longer matched her reference points. Every route ended in dead ends or impassable gullies. As her condition worsened, she also developed symptoms of severe heat illness, including dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment, further reducing her ability to navigate. As temperatures peaked, Phil collapsed first and became unresponsive. Meilani attempted to move him into the limited shade of a gully wall, but conditions were no longer survivable in place. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died later that evening from hyperthermia and organ failure following prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Meilani remained with him for a period of time before attempting to retrace their route toward the road for help. However, by this point, she was also experiencing advanced heat stroke symptoms, including confusion, impaired judgment, and severe dehydration. Her movement became increasingly erratic, and she lost reliable orientation within the branching drainage system. This is one of those points where even a familiar route doesn't really exist the same way anymore. It just turns into disconnected pieces that don't line up. She was later found in a separate section of the Badlands after collapsing during attempted self-evacuation. She died from severe hyperthermia and dehydration after prolonged exposure and heat stroke, with investigators noting that cognitive decline likely occurred while she was still attempting to navigate out rather than after sustained independent travel. Rescue teams arrived the following morning. Phil was recovered from the original shelter site, while Meilani was found further along the drainage system. Both fatalities were attributed to extreme heat exposure, insufficient water supply, and delayed evacuation from hazardous terrain. An official review concluded that the incident resulted from a combination of factors, including insufficient water supply, off-trail travel in hazardous terrain, reliance on non-verified digital navigation, and delayed response to escalating heat illness. The case was later used in safety briefings highlighting how rapidly desert environments can become life-threatening when exposure, dehydration, and disorientation occur simultaneously. It was the 16th of October 2024, and the first cable cars of the morning were climbing out of the valley at Huashan, a granite mountain in north-central China whose ridgelines are so steep they look drawn rather than real. In one of those swaying cabins sat a 25-year-old American with a chest harness of camera gear, 2 phones, and a plan he'd been teasing his followers about for weeks. Below him, the cliffs of one of the most sacred mountains in the country dropped away in sheets of pale rock. He was not there for the temples, and he was not really there for the hike. He was there for roughly 15 seconds of video. His name was Dutton Stuckey. He was from Tempe, Arizona, and on TikTok he was a stunt and travel creator with a following in the thousands and ambitions far past it. His feed was a highlight reel of places most people would never stand. Rooftop edges, cliff jumps into green water, narrow ridgelines in Utah and Norway, always shot close, always with his easy grin in the corner of the frame. He was not reckless in the way people assume. He planned obsessively, scouted everything, and had never once been seriously hurt. That record was the most dangerous thing he owned. Here is the part of this story you have to sit with first. Dutton did not wake up that morning planning to gamble his life for strangers. He woke up planning content, the same as every other morning. Because when your identity, your sense of worth, and the career you are chasing all come from one app, the question is never whether a video is safe. The question is whether it will perform. Thousands of followers sounds like success to most people, but I see them as a number that'll only end up ruining you the more you obsess over it. Huashan is one of the 5 great mountains of China, a place Taoist hermits have climbed for more than 2,000 years, rising out of Shanxi province about 80 miles east of the old capital of Xi'an. It has 5 peaks, and the south peak is the highest of them, at just over 7,000 feet, a dome of bare granite with temples and stone stairways carved into it. It is a national 5A rated scenic area, the highest designation China gives, and on holiday weeks, tens of thousands of visitors a day move through its gondolas and staircases. People have been climbing this mountain on purpose for a very long time. Taoist pilgrims cut the first stairways into the granite centuries ago, some so steep they are closer to ladders, with names like the Heavenly Stairs and the Black Dragon Ridge, and to this day, porters haul drinking water and instant noodles up those same steps on shoulder poles for the summit shops. Every chain railing on the upper mountain is armored in padlocks, engraved love locks, and red ribbons left by couples and families, tens of thousands of them, a record of everyone who came up here to feel small in the good way. And bolted to the eastern face of that south peak is the reason Dutton flew across the Pacific Ocean. It is called the Changkong Plank Road, the plank walk in the sky, and it was first built by a Taoist priest more than 700 years ago, wooden boards resting on stone pegs driven into a vertical cliff. The modern version runs a little over 300 feet in 3 sections, a chiseled ledge, then a near vertical descent on iron rungs, and then the famous part, a row of wooden planks about 1 foot wide, with the rock face on one side of you and open sky on the other. And remember, it is a dead end. Whoever walks out has to turn around and come back along the same boards. Picture wooden boards about as wide as a laptop bolted to a cliff, and honestly, even that description is underselling it. The mountain knows exactly what it is selling, and it sells it carefully. At the entrance to the plank walk, attendants rent every visitor a shoulder harness for 30 yuan, about $4, with 2 short lanyards and 2 carabiners that clip onto a steel safety cable running the length of the route. The system is simple and strict. You slide both carabiners along as you move, and when you reach an anchor point, or need to get around a person coming the other way, you unclip one, move it past, clip it shut, and only then move the second. One clip is always closed. That is the entire religion of the place. The choreography of passing is the part first-timers never expect. The walk is 2-way traffic on a one-body ledge, so strangers end up chest to chest, negotiating in whatever language works, one person hugging the rock while the other steps around the outside of them over open air. Travelers' accounts are full of small horror stories. A neighbor who unclipped the wrong carabiner by mistake, a teenager filming with both hands, and at the exit, booths will engrave you a souvenir medal for 10 yuan announcing that you survived the plank walk in the sky. The mountain has turned its own danger into the product. The internet calls it the most dangerous hike in the world. And for years, a rumor has floated around that 100 people die on Huashan every year, a number nobody has ever confirmed and the park has never acknowledged. The truth is less cinematic. The mountain's grim reputation comes mostly from its ancient staircases in the decades before railings and cables, while the plank walk itself, with the harness system, has been remarkably controlled. The gear is worn and the operation is informal, but the math only fails when somebody takes themselves out of it. Guides will tell you the cable has worked for years precisely because nobody tests it, the same way a fence works until somebody climbs it, and in all the footage from that route, almost nobody ever had. 2 carabiners stand between every visitor and the bottom of that cliff, and I need you to remember the number 2. Dutton had been studying that math for a different reason. There is a whole genre on these platforms. Climbers and daredevils hanging one-handed off cranes, sitting on skyscraper ledges, dangling off cliff lips with their feet swinging over nothing, and the numbers on those videos are not normal numbers. His own biggest video, a little over 1 million views, was him hanging off a sandstone edge in Utah with no rope. He knew precisely what the algorithm paid for, and it was not scenery. It was the unprotected human body in places where it should not be. I have watched hundreds of those clips researching these stories, and the cruel part is that the audience is not lying. The views are real, the sponsors are real, the career is real. The internet will happily pay a young man to stand closer and closer to the edge of his own life. It just never discusses the exchange rate.
Dangling off cliffs with no rope built entire careers on that app, and I blame every one of those accounts a little.
The views reward only the risk, never the ride home. Getting there was the easy part, and his vlogs documented all of it. The long haul across the Pacific and the connecting flight into Xi'an with his roommate and cameraman, a quiet 26-year-old named Reed Haggerty. The bullet train to Huashan North Station, barely half an hour. The shuttle bus winding half an hour up the Gorge Road to the West Peak cable car, then the cable car itself, a 20-minute ride over ravines that already had tourists gasping, and then the stone stairways toward the South Peak, through chain railings padlocked with thousands of red prayer ribbons and engraved love locks. They spent the night before in Huayin, the small city at the mountain's feet, in a hostel room with a window that framed the dark mass of the mountain blotting out the stars along the southern sky. Dutton posted a teaser that evening, his face in the dark with the lit cliffs behind him, promising his followers the most dangerous hike on Earth in the morning. Posted through the roaming data on his American phone plan, since the app does not work on Chinese networks, the clip pulled tens of thousands of views while he slept. Reed would tell investigators later, in so many words, that the trip had felt charmed up to that point. Smooth flights, perfect weather, a feed full of people telling his best friend to be careful and not meaning it. By late morning, the two of them were standing in the line for the plank walk, and the line itself is its own warning. Visitors wait on a narrow rock shelf with 2 iron chains for a railing and no harness yet, while everyone who has finished the walk squeezes back through the same bottleneck in the opposite direction. A dropped water bottle rolled past Dutton's boot while they waited, took one bounce, and went off the edge into silence. He filmed it. The caption he added later called it foreshadowing, with a laughing emoji.
Mr. Liang clips thousands of strangers onto that cable every season, and I doubt he ever forgot the one who unclipped himself.
At the front of the line, an attendant, the regulars, called Mr. Liang, had been fitting harnesses on that ledge for years. He cinched the straps across Dutton's chest, clipped both carabiners onto the cable, tugged each one twice, and gave the safety speech he gives hundreds of times a day, half in Mandarin, half in gestures, pointing at the clips, holding up one finger, then shaking his head with 2 fingers raised, one at a time, never both. Dutton nodded along, smiled for his own camera, and said something for the vlog about how the man took his job seriously. The first section eases you in, a chiseled ledge with an iron fence where everyone laughs a little too loudly. Then comes the descent, 30 feet of iron rungs hammered straight down the rock where the laughing stops and people climb down facing the cliff, clip by clip, hands going white on the chains. And then you step sideways onto the planks themselves, and the planet simply ends. 1 foot of weathered wood, polished smooth by decades of shuffling sneakers, the granite wall pressed against your shoulder, and below your heels, a drop of nearly 1,000 feet before the cliff even begins to lean back. People describe their first step onto that wood in religious terms. Knees refusing orders, hands moving on their own, and a strange tunnel quiet. The murmur of the queue gone, only wind and breath left.
His first run across those planks was completely by the book, and I wish with everything that he had just stopped there.
One safe, beautiful video was already sitting on that phone. Dutton's first pass, the one almost nobody talks about, was flawless. He went out midday with the crowds, both carabiners singing along the cable, GoPro in his teeth half the time, and did everything right. He shuffled sideways like everyone else, pressed his chest to the rock when oncoming hikers passed, moved 1 clip at a time around every anchor, waited his turn at the famous corner where the boards bend around the cliff. Reed filmed him from behind. The footage was beautiful. The mountain had handed him a perfectly good video. They ate instant noodles on the South Peak afterward, and Dutton scrubbed through the clips with his thumb, and the people who were with him that day say his face just slowly closed down. It looked, he said, in so many words, like every other Huashan video ever posted. Same planks, same harness, same nervous grin. There were already 100,000 of those online, filmed by Chinese tourists for Douyin, the version of the app that actually works inside China, and by every backpacker who had come through with a GoPro since the route got famous. He scrolled the mountain's hashtag right there at the table, hundreds of identical thumbnails, and the people with him remember him saying, in so many words, that being one of 100,000 was worse than never coming at all. That review session on the summit is the moment I would freeze if I could. The safe video was already on the phone. The trip was already paid for. The mountain was already conquered. His mother was already going to see it. Every single thing he came for existed by noon. What happened next was not about getting the shot. It was about getting a shot nobody else had.
Reading a comment section can do more damage than any cliff, and I mean the comments daring him to lose the rope.
His plan crystallized over that lunch, and Reed would later describe arguing against it for an hour, in so many words, and losing. They would wait until late afternoon, when the tour groups thinned out and the light went gold, and go back out a second time. Out near the far end of the planks, where the cable sags between anchors and the cliff swallows the sound, Dutton would hand his phone to Reed, and he would do the thing his comment section had been daring him to do for 2 years. He would take the harness out of the picture. Reed's side of that argument deserves to be remembered, because he made every point a safety officer would have made. He said the harness could be cropped, blurred, edited around. He said the comment section would dare him right up to the edge and then post crying emojis afterward. He said the difference between this stunt and the Utah one was that Utah had a ledge 4 feet down. And then he ran into the wall every friend of every creator runs into, which is that you cannot clip an adult to a cable against his will, and being there with him felt safer than letting him come back alone with a tripod. A few minutes past 4:30, roughly an hour before the route stopped admitting people for the day, they were back at the entrance, paying 30 yuan each for the second time that day. The ledge was nearly empty now. Mister. Liang fitted the straps again, and the people behind them in line that afternoon remember him being slower about it the second time, looking at the camera rig, looking at Dutton's face, repeating the gesture with the 2 raised fingers and the shake of the head. There is no rule against walking the planks twice, and there was no rule against most of what was about to happen, because nobody had ever needed one.
Going back for a second pass near closing time tells me everything. He wanted that walkway quiet and nobody watching.
They worked their way out past the corner, past a pair of hikers heading home, to the stretch Dutton had scouted on the first pass, a quiet run of boards near the route's far end, with clean rock above and nothing below but evening haze. The sun was dropping toward the ridgelines to the west, and the cliff had turned the color of honey. Reed braced himself against the wall a few feet away, both his own carabiners locked, and started recording. Dutton looked into the lens and talked for a minute about fear being a choice. The escalation was gradual, which is the part that haunts the people who study accidents like this. First, he sat down on the edge of the planks, boots hanging over the void, both clips still closed, and that alone was a frame most creators would have flown home happy with. Then he leaned back on his palms. Then he asked Reed whether the lanyards were visible in the shot. They were. Of course they were. That is the entire point of them. 2 bright slings running from his chest to the cable-like seatbelts in a car commercial.
Passing another hiker means one clip comes off for a moment, and believe me, the second is never supposed to open.
So, he unclipped one. Click, off the cable, and he tucked the lanyard back over his shoulder, out of the frame. One carabiner still held him, which technically kept him inside the system. The same single-clip state every hiker passes through for a few seconds at every anchor point. He checked the frame again. The remaining slings still cut across the bottom of the shot, one thin line of webbing between this video and the million-view video, between looking brave and being brave. Reed told him in so many words that it looked fine. Dutton did not agree. What he wanted has a name in that corner of the internet. The free solo look. No rope, no rail, no strap, just a human being. And the air. The grammar of the most viral climbing footage ever shot. Audiences scroll past safety the way they scroll past ads. Dutton knew his comment section by heart, knew the exact phrases waiting under a harnessed video, knew the difference in the numbers, and out there on the boards, with the light perfect and the planks to themselves, all of that knowledge weighed more than the cable did.
Authenticity is the word he used for removing his own lifeline, and I've hated that word ever since.
The harness ruined the shot. That was his entire reasoning. At 7 minutes past 5 in the evening, the second carabiner came off the cable. Reed's voice on the recording goes tight, telling him this part is not worth it, asking him to clip back in, and Dutton answers the way he always answered, easy, unbothered, saying in so many words that he had climbed harder things in flip-flops, that he needed 30 seconds, that the grip was good, both lanyards were tucked behind his shoulders now. On the screen of the phone, he looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, a man on a cliff with nothing holding him because nothing was. Reed has talked about those next minutes exactly once to the police, and his account is the spine of everything we know. He stayed clipped, back against the granite, the phone in one hand and his other hand free on purpose, he said, in case. He remembers deciding that the fastest way to end the stunt was to film it well, no retakes, one clean shot, and then everybody clips in and goes down the mountain for dumplings. He remembers the wind being almost nothing. He remembers thinking the light really was perfect and hating himself for thinking it.
Both carabiners hanging open on his chest meant nothing on that mountain was holding him anymore, and it kind of makes me sick.
Then, he did the thing he had flown 8,000 miles to do. He turned to face the mountain, knelt down on the boards, took the worn front edge of the planks in both hands, and lowered his body off the walkway until he hung at full extension over the east face of the South Peak, arms straight, feet swimming gently above 1,000 feet of nothing. He looked up into the lens and grinned. On the recording, you can hear Reed breathing. Somewhere down the route, a woman who saw it later told police she assumed it was a mannequin, because no person would do that. One other person saw what happened next. A hiker from Chengdu was resting at the corner where the boards bend, close enough to see but too far to matter, and she stood frozen with both hands on the cable. Far below them, birds were cutting through the evening air against the cliff face, which is the detail she could not stop repeating to officers afterward, that there were birds flying beneath a human being's shoes. The attendant station was out of sight around the rock. There was nobody on that mountain with the authority or the reach to stop what was already in motion.
Hanging by your fingers above 1,000 feet of air for a phone is a trade I'll never understand.
Here is what was happening inside his hands during those seconds, because this is where the story was always going to be decided. A dead hang looks static, but it is a countdown. Forearm muscles locked in a closed fist burn through their fuel astonishingly fast, and the burn arrives quietly, a warmth, then a tremble, then a strange distance, like the fingers belong to someone else. The boards he gripped were not a gym bar. They were hand-worn wood, rounded at the lip, faintly gritty with dust, and his palms had been sweating since the second carabiner opened. On the recording, the hang lasts 26 seconds, and the people who have seen it say you can watch the transaction happen in his face. Second 5, the grin, the eyebrow raise, the money shot already banked. Second 12, the grin tightens at the corners as the forearms send their first invoice. Second 18, his feet stop swinging and go still, the body instinctively cutting every gram of wasted motion. And Reed's voice says, "Come up now," twice, no longer sounding like a cameraman. Second 20, Dutton starts the pull. That was supposed to be routine.
Grip strength fails quietly, not loudly, and I knew his forearms were on a countdown the second he lowered himself.
Forearms do not negotiate, they just quit. 20 seconds in, he started to pull back up, and the pull-up that had never once failed him in his life failed him for the first time in the one place it could not. His elbows bent, his chin reached the level of the planks, and then his right hand, repositioning for a higher hold on the smooth edge, slid. The recording shows his whole body drop 3 inches and catch on one arm. The grin disappeared. What replaced it, frame by frame, was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he had never planned to do, with numbers that were already finished. Pull-ups in a gym are nothing like one pull-up over a void, and I could feel his arms giving out from here. Reed moved faster than thinking. He dropped to the boards on his knees, still clipped, and lunged for the wrist that was still holding, and his fingers closed on the cuff of Dutton's jacket sleeve. For 1/2 of 1 second, there was a connection between them, nylon and fingertips, 26 years old holding 25 years old above the bottom of the world. Then, the fabric pulled through. Anyone who has studied falls will tell you that no grip in the world arrests a falling adult by a jacket cuff. It did not matter. Reed will measure that half second for the rest of his life.
Reed got 2 fingers on his friend's sleeve, and that half second is something I wouldn't wish on anyone.
At 11 minutes past 5 in the evening, Dutton Stuckey came off the plank walk in the sky. There was no scream on the recording. The witnesses all said the same impossible thing, that it happened in complete silence. Just the shape of him dropping away from the boards and growing smaller against the granite until the east face of the South Peak took him out of view. He fell nearly 1,000 feet to the first broken terraces of the cliff. Nobody on that mountain could reach him, and no fall of that height leaves anything for a rescuer to do. He was gone before the echo of Reed's shout came back off the rock. Silence is what every witness on those planks described next, and I have thought about that lack of sound for weeks. The attendants cleared and closed the plank walk within minutes, and scenic area police led Reed, still clipped to the cable and unable to stand, back along the boards he had just watched his best friend leave. A recovery team reached the body at first light the next morning, far below, where the cliff finally relents into broken slopes, and the American embassy in Beijing was notified that day. His family in Arizona learned what had happened before most of his followers did. The final video was never posted. Reed handed the phone to the police, and as far as anyone knows, the footage has never left their evidence room. Hua Shan did not change after Dutton died, because it did not need to. The cable was there, the rules were there, Mr. Liang's 2 raised fingers were there, and every one of them had done its job until the moment a healthy young man methodically removed himself from all of it for a camera. What changed was the argument. Chinese outlets pointed to the country's tourist blacklist system and asked why stunt creators were still being let onto sites like this at all, and his own industry asked it too, quieter, between tributes. His account is still up. The pinned video, the one with 1 million views, is him hanging off an edge by his hands.
Banning influencers from places like this gets debated every time someone dies, and I finally understand both sides of it. The mountain kept its rules. He was the one who left them.
It was October 5th, 2021. The Grapevine Mountains in Death Valley National Park formed a remote canyon system of fractured volcanic rock and narrow drainages, where small navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation due to distance and lack of visible reference. Points once off the main track. Theo Barsanti, 41, was a California-based documentary creator running a YouTube channel focused on abandoned sites, mining history, and forgotten infrastructure. While experienced in basic exploration, his recent work had increasingly become audience-driven, with expeditions shaped by viewer interest, narrative structure, and production timelines rather than purely logistical caution. For months, Barsanti had been pursuing a potential forgotten mining structure based on early 20th century archival photographs. After narrowing its possible location through historical mapping, he identified a remote canyon system in Death Valley as the most likely site. He framed the expedition for his audience as a discovery-focused field mission.
Honestly, I'd already be cautious here because once a route is built off historical fragments like this, there's a lot of room for gaps between the map and the actual ground.
Although presented as carefully planned, key decisions were influenced by content timing and narrative continuity. The destination was only generally disclosed, preserving suspense for later release. He departed before sunrise, reaching the canyon approach via a rough four-wheel drive track. His vehicle was not well suited for sustained off-road conditions, but he proceeded under the assumption that the route would remain passable based on limited prior reconnaissance and earlier satellite reference points.
Looking at this, I'm already uneasy about relying on assumption in terrain like that.
As the track deteriorated, repeated impacts and uneven terrain caused mechanical strain, eventually leading to a tire failure. After a temporary roadside repair, he continued deeper rather than retreating, influenced by time pressure and the expectation of reaching the target site within daylight hours. At a narrowing section of the access route, the vehicle became high-centered in an erosion channel and could not be moved in either direction. He was stranded several miles from his intended staging point with limited water, no reliable communication, and a destination still farther inside the canyon system. At this point, Barsanti made a critical decision influenced by both logistical pressure and content continuity. He abandoned the vehicle and continued on foot while documenting the situation. This marked the transition from planned travel to unsupported backcountry movement. Initial foot travel was slow but manageable as he entered the drainage system. However, the canyon quickly split into multiple visually similar branches, making route tracking increasingly uncertain. Without stable signal or reliable landmarks, navigation depended on memory and intermittent visual cues from earlier filming. By midday, he reached the mining site he had been searching for, wooden structural remnants and stone foundations built into the canyon wall. The discovery confirmed his research and became a key content milestone. He spent extended time filming and photographing the site, gradually consuming less water than conditions required. This reduced his reserves earlier than planned for the return journey. After completing documentation, he began his return. However, the canyon's branching structure created subtle directional errors, and he soon entered unfamiliar drainage paths. The loss of phone power eliminated digital navigation, forcing reliance on visual memory under increasing heat stress. As he retraced his steps, repeated dead ends, forced backtracking, increasing exertion, and delaying progress, fatigue accumulated, and dehydration and heat exposure began to significantly impair judgment of distance, time, and direction. I just keep picturing him looping back through the same dry cuts and not realizing how much ground that actually adds up to. During a descent over unstable talus, he slipped and sustained a severe ankle injury that sharply reduced mobility. The injury turned a routine return into a prolonged and physically demanding exit through unstable terrain, increasing exertion, and accelerating fluid loss. As daylight faded, he briefly re-established visual recognition of a known ridgeline and managed to reach his vehicle in the early evening, significantly dehydrated, injured, and in clear physiological distress. After restoring limited phone functionality using remaining battery reserves, he contacted his spouse and transmitted his location, prompting an emergency response. A ranger unit was dispatched and arrived after a delay due to distance, road conditions, and limited nighttime access. He was found in the vehicle in critical condition, showing signs consistent with severe exertional heat stroke. Despite immediate field treatment and rapid evacuation toward medical care, his condition deteriorated during transport due to progressive hyperthermia and multi-system failure. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified cumulative risk factors including limited route sharing, solo travel, extended content capture periods, and reliance on incomplete communication redundancy. The incident was later cited in discussions on influencer-driven fieldwork, where production pressure and narrative continuity were identified as contributing factors in operational decision-making under hazardous desert conditions. This story starts in July 16, 2019, with 4 gym buddies named Mason Price, Derek Alvarez, Silas Crane, and Tobias Renner. Mason was 29, Derek was 31, Silas was 28, Tobias was 30. They'd been training together for years at the same gym, and from what people who knew them said, they were the kind of friends who couldn't just lift weights together without turning it into some kind of contest. Who could bench more? Who could run faster? Who could go longer without eating before a workout?
You could pick literally anything, and these 4 had probably already argued about it. At some point, the conversation turned to endurance, and somebody brought up Death Valley. You've probably heard of it, even if you've never been close to it.
It's one of the hottest places on the planet during the summer, with temperatures that regularly climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias heard about how brutal the heat could get out there, and instead of filing that away as a fun fact, they turned it into a bet. Whoever gave up first on a hike through the park would owe the other 3 an entire year of gym membership fees.
I want to pause right here because this is the part that gets me every time I think about it. A year of membership fees is, what, maybe $600?
$800 if the gym is fancy. These 4 were about to risk their lives over something you could solve by just paying for your own membership and not betting it. That's the thing about competitive friendship sometimes. The stakes don't even have to make sense. It's never really about the money. It's about not being the one who backs down.
Here's where it also gets really interesting for me, and honestly also a little bit disturbing.
These 4 didn't just wake up one day and drive out to the desert. They spent almost 3 weeks planning this thing. Most of that planning focused on the challenge itself. They wanted an empty trail, uninterrupted footage, and a chance to prove they could handle conditions that most people avoided. Part of that meant not advertising the plan to people who might try to talk them out of it.
Think about that for a second.
They weren't breaking rules or entering restricted areas. The 4 hikers believed they were skilled and prepared enough to handle conditions that others couldn't. Despite repeatedly encountering warnings against strenuous hiking in extreme heat, they viewed those warnings as being meant for less capable people, not themselves. They thoroughly researched the trail, weather, maps, and trip reports, but ultimately underestimated the danger of the heat.
I think this is where their thinking went completely sideways, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Most people read a warning like that and think, okay, I shouldn't go.
These 4 read the same warning and thought, great, that means the trail will be empty. They took a list of reasons to stay away and flipped it into a list of reasons the plan would work. It's such a small shift in thinking, but it changes everything that happens after. During planning, the 4 men saw the extreme heat as an advantage rather than a danger. With fewer visitors during heat waves, they expected an empty trail where they could carry out their challenge without interference. To avoid encountering others, they chose a remote trail, picked a Tuesday instead of a busy weekend, and planned to start before sunrise. Their decisions were aimed at minimizing contact with anyone who might discourage them from continuing.
Now, before I go further into the story, I want to know your first reaction to hearing that they were actively trying to avoid people who might talk them out of it. Let me know in the comments.
Honestly, this part bugs me more than almost anything else in this story. They did real research, they weren't lazy about it, they just used all that information backward. It's like reading a manual on how a bomb works and concluding the best plan is to stand closer to it. As they researched more, their confidence grew instead of their caution. Studying maps, forecasts, and trail information gave them a false sense of expertise, leading them to believe that their fitness and gym experience would protect them from the desert's dangers. They increasingly viewed heat warnings as advice for unprepared tourists rather than for people like themselves. They also concealed key details from family and friends, describing the trip as ordinary sightseeing rather than a competitive challenge. They avoided discussing the wager, the specific trail, or their plans online, hoping to prevent experienced hikers from discouraging them. Their intention was to document the challenge and reveal it afterward as proof of the outcome. By the final week before the hike, isolation wasn't just a side effect of their planning anymore. It had become the goal. They pictured an empty trail where nobody could interrupt their competition. Nobody could see either of them quit, and nobody could tell them they'd gone too far. And here's the tragic irony of the whole thing. Every single safeguard they removed from their own plan was also a potential source of help that they were throwing away without realizing it. And the worst part is that their plan worked. It worked almost perfectly. The morning they set out, they barely saw anyone. No ranger happened to be in the area that morning, which wasn't unusual given the sheer size of Death Valley and how few people were hiking remote trails during extreme heat. No experienced hiker on the trail questioned their route or their timing. No friend called partway through the day to check in. All that privacy they worked so hard to build for themselves ended up meaning that when things started going wrong, there was nobody nearby who could recognize it and step in. Before they even started hiking, the four of them sat down and came up with a set of rules for their competition. And reading through what investigators later pieced together from their footage, these rules are almost unbelievable in how reckless they were. Not one of them was allowed to voluntarily quit without losing the bet outright. Any rest stop longer than 5 minutes counted as a sign of weakness. Any complaint about the heat or about being tired was treated as nothing more than an excuse. Every major checkpoint along the route had to be filmed as proof they'd actually reached it. And whoever made it to the turnaround point first would get extra bragging rights on top of winning the bet. So basically, in the span of a few sentences, a goofy competition between friends turned into a set of rules that actively punished either one of them for admitting they were struggling.
That's the part that really gets under my skin. They built a system where the smart decision, stopping, resting, turning around, was treated as failure.
They engineered their own peer pressure into the trip before they'd even taken a single step. They started hiking before the sun came up, just like they'd planned. For the first several miles, everything felt easy. The temperature was still relatively bearable in those early hours, and all four of them were full of energy. Their phones captured non-stop trash talk between them. Mason bragged that years of heavy lifting and serious conditioning had basically prepared him for anything the desert could throw at him. Derek pushed back, insisting that mental toughness mattered way more than any hydration plan or safety precaution. Silas claimed his trail experience put him a step ahead of everyone else. Tobias just laughed and said he'd settle the whole argument by finishing first.
Watching this part of the footage, if you didn't know how the story ended, you'd think you were watching four confident athletes treating a desert hike just like another gym challenge.
They laughed at the warning signs posted along the trail about extreme heat. They joked that people online had clearly exaggerated how bad it could get. The trail being nearly empty only made them more confident, because to them, every mile they covered without seeing another soul felt like proof their planning had paid off. At several points in the footage, they comment on how few people they've seen out there. Mason jokes that the whole park basically belongs to them now. Derek responds that this is exactly why they picked a weak forecast to experience some of the most extreme temperatures of the summer to do this.
I think this moment is honestly the saddest part of the early footage, even though nothing bad has really happened yet.
Not one of them understood that the emptiness around them wasn't a reward for being tough. It was a warning that almost everyone else had already decided the conditions were unsafe, and they were the only four who hadn't gotten the message yet. Once the sun actually rose, everything started changing fast. The landscape around them began throwing heat back at them from every direction. There were long stretches of trail with almost no shade anywhere in sight. Sweat poured off all four of them, and within a relatively short stretch of time, their shirts were completely soaked through. Derek noticed he was drinking a lot more water than he'd planned for. Mason developed a headache, but brushed it off as just normal exertion from the hike. Silas started favoring one leg slightly, but didn't say anything. Tobias felt his pace slipping, but kept pushing to stay even with the others. Their conversations got shorter. The joking that had filled the early morning faded out. None of them said out loud that the effort was becoming harder than they'd expected. Instead, each guy looked at the others struggling and saw it as proof that the competition was actually working the way it was supposed to. The trail stayed mostly empty through this stretch. Hours passed without any real contact with another person. What had felt like freedom earlier in the morning now meant there was nobody around to notice just how quickly things were changing for the four of them. Heat radiated straight up from the sun-baked rock and dirt under their boots, and the ground itself seemed to be holding onto that warmth and throwing it right back at them. Like the whole desert was cooking them from every angle at once.
This is the point in the story where if you'd be a somewhat reasonable person, you would have turned around.
The headache, the sweat, the sudden water consumption, those are your body's early warning lights. But because they'd built this whole competition around punishing weakness, none one of them could let themselves see those warning signs for what they actually were. As the temperature kept climbing, the whole thing got more aggressive. The four of them started racing certain stretches of the trail. Whenever one guy stopped for even a brief moment, the others pushed ahead without him. Small breaks that should have been opportunities to rest turned into chances to gain an advantage in the competition. When Derek suggested taking a longer break at one point, Mason immediately mocked him for it on camera. When Mason started breathing heavily, climbing a steep section, Derek accused him of slowing down on purpose. When Silas asked if anyone else was feeling dizzy, Tobias brushed it off as nothing. None of them wanted to look weaker than the others, and their decisions, every single one of them at this point, were being driven by pride instead of by what their bodies were actually telling them. The environment that had felt totally manageable before sunrise now felt openly hostile. The air kept getting hotter with every hour that passed. Heat radiated up from the ground while the sun beat straight down on them from above, basically squeezing them between two sources of heat. And still, no one was willing to admit out loud that maybe they had underestimated exactly what the desert could do to them.
I keep coming back to this idea of pride overriding instinct, because I think it's the actual core of this whole tragedy. These weren't dumb guys.
They were fit, they were prepared on paper, they did their research. But pride is sneaky. It convinces you that admitting weakness is more dangerous than the actual physical danger you're standing in. And by this point in the hike, that's exactly the trap they'd fallen into. By mid-morning, all four of them realized they'd gone through way more water than they had planned for. Before the hike even started, each of them had packed roughly 2 gallons. During their research, they'd seen recommendations suggesting that extreme summer conditions could require far more water than that, especially on exposed routes, but everyone convinced themselves that their fitness and early start would make those estimates overly cautious. At the time, 2 gallons had seemed like more than enough. But a few hours into the heat, all 4 of them were shocked at how fast their supplies were disappearing. And instead of treating this discovery as a reason to slow down or turn back, it sparked a whole new competition between them. Rather than having an honest conversation about how to manage the situation safely, everyone became fixated on proving they were handling the heat better than the others. Derek started quietly rationing his water without saying anything. Mason started sneaking bigger gulps whenever nobody was watching. Silas began hiding how much he had left, while Tobias started timing his sips so the others wouldn't notice how thirsty he really was. They kept checking each other's bottles throughout the day. Nobody wanted to admit any concern, because in their minds, showing concern was basically the same thing as surrendering.
Gotta be honest, I shook my head on this one.
Because running out of water faster than expected in Death Valley in the summer should be an obvious, flashing red alarm. It's not a small detail. It's basically the most important warning your body and your supplies can give you out there, and these 4 looked at that warning and decided it was just another obstacle to push through rather than a reason to stop. As the temperature pushed toward genuinely dangerous levels, the first serious symptoms started showing up. Mason developed worsening headaches along with occasional dizziness. Derek started getting painful muscle cramps in his legs. Silas began losing his balance on flat ground. Tobias started slurring his words without noticing. All of them became increasingly irritable, started making small mistakes they normally wouldn't have made, and found themselves arguing over minor issues that hadn't seemed important earlier in the morning. Their pace noticeably slowed down. The video clips they were still recording got shorter, because by this point, just talking required real effort. Long silences started appearing between the recordings. In one clip, Mason struggled to remember a distance estimate he himself had mentioned earlier that same day. In another, Derek just pauses for several seconds, clearly trying to recall what the next checkpoint on their route was supposed to be. In one of Silas's last clear recordings, he repeats the same sentence twice without realizing it. Tobias, in his, just stares at the camera for several seconds before saying anything at all. All of them laughed these moments off when they happened. What made the situation especially dangerous was that the warning signs weren't arriving one at a time. Forgetfulness, irritability, poor decisions, physical exhaustion, and misplaced confidence were all beginning to overlap and reinforce one another. No one recognized them as warning signs, even though to anyone watching from the outside, and especially to anyone who knows anything about heat illness, those moments are about as clear a red flag as you can get. The heat at this point was becoming genuinely overwhelming. Temperatures kept rising while the 4 of them stayed out in the open, with basically no real protection from the sun. Mason kept pulling out the trail map and studying it, but he was struggling to interpret information that he'd reviewed in detail before the hike even started. Derek kept forgetting where he'd packed certain pieces of equipment in his own backpack. Silas kept asking the others how far they'd already gone, even though he'd asked minutes before. Tobias kept stopping to check a checkpoint marker that wasn't actually there yet. Simple conversations between them started turning into arguments. They debated distances they had already covered together. They disagreed about how much water was actually left between them. They kept asking each other questions that had already been answered just minutes earlier. Mason noticed that Derek was becoming unusually forgetful and irritable, but he chalked it up to exhaustion, making his friend dramatic. Derek noticed Mason struggling with basic navigation decisions, but he dismissed it as Mason just being stubborn. Silas noticed Tobias slurring his words, but figured he was just tired. Tobias noticed Silas stumbling, but assumed he'd twisted his ankle. None of them stopped to consider that they were all actively showing signs of heat-related cognitive impairment.
I want to slow down here for a second because I want to stress out that heat exhaustion and heat stroke don't just hurt your body.
They hurt your brain. They mess with your ability to recognize that something is wrong in the first place. So you end up with this horrible situation where the exact thing that's putting you in danger is also the thing stealing away your ability to notice the danger. These four weren't just getting physically weaker. Their judgment, the one tool that could have saved them, was breaking down right along with everything else. By late morning, all four men were showing obvious signs of severe heat stress, and yet none of them believed they were actually in serious danger. Mason kept insisting on camera that he felt fine, even while he was visibly stumbling on flat ground. Derek laughed off his own symptoms, claiming he'd pushed through worse during regular gym workouts. Silas insisted his balance issues were just an old knee injury acting up. Tobias claimed he was talking slow on purpose, like it was some kind of joke. Their videos from this stretch capture increasingly irrational conversations. They talked about completing extra mileage after finishing the challenge, like they were planning some kind of victory lap. They made wildly unrealistic estimates about how quickly they could finish the rest of the route. To anyone watching this footage afterward, it's obvious almost instantly that none of them was thinking clearly anymore. But to the four of them, in that moment, everything still felt completely manageable. As the temperature kept climbing, all of their phones started showing overheating warnings after extended periods of recording in direct sunlight. Recording became more and more sporadic as the devices repeatedly shut down the camera function until they could cool back down. Even their equipment was struggling to survive out there, and somehow that still didn't register as a sign for any of them to stop. Eventually, the tension between them boiled over completely. Mason started blaming Derek for encouraging the challenge in the first place. Derek blamed Mason for picking an overly ambitious route. Silas blamed Tobias for talking everyone into a remote trail instead of a marked one. Tobias blamed Silas for insisting they push through midday instead of resting in the shade. They accused each other of wasting water. They accused each other of slowing down the pace and dragging the whole thing out. The argument kept escalating and getting more confused as it went. None of them could really articulate what they were even upset about anymore. Small, minor grievances turned into full-blown confrontations. Eventually, the argument shifted toward their remaining water and what direction they should take next. Derek wanted to slow down and reconsider the route. Mason accused him of using that as an excuse to quit. Derek fired back that Mason had pushed them too far into the heat. Silas sided with Mason, Tobias sided with Derek. After several increasingly confused arguments about water, pace, and navigation, the group split into two pairs, each one going their own direction. Each of them had convinced himself that the others were the entire reason the day had gone so badly.
I want you to imagine that scenario. Four guys who started the day as best friends and training partners ended up splitting apart from each other.
Alone, in one of the hottest places on Earth, because their judgment had deteriorated to the point where teaming up felt worse than going it alone.
If there's a single decision in this entire story that sealed their fate, I think it's this one.
Once they separated, all four of their conditions got worse fast. Mason kept recording occasional updates on his phone, and honestly, the footage from this stretch is hard to watch. He repeats the same observations multiple times without seeming to realize he's already said them. He struggles to hold the phone steady, his speech becomes increasingly disorganized and hard to follow. At one point in the recordings, he even seems uncertain about which direction he's actually traveling in. Investigators later determined that he gradually wandered away from the route they had originally planned, likely without even realizing it. Silas, who'd paired off with Mason, his final recordings show him sitting motionless for long stretches, occasionally mumbling about needing to catch up to the others. Derek's decline looked a little different. He started sitting down repeatedly for what he believed were just brief rests, but each stop ended up lasting longer than the one before it. He began leaving pieces of equipment behind along the trail because carrying them simply felt too exhausting. Investigators later used those abandoned items to piece together a rough timeline of his decline as the day went on. His final recordings are full of long pauses and incomplete thoughts that just trail off. Several recordings he apparently tried to make were never even completed because his phone kept overheating after sitting exposed to direct sunlight on the open trail. Tobias, paired with Derek, drifted away from him gradually, the two losing sight of each other without either one noticing exactly when it happened.
Can't even begin to imagine how alone they all were by this point, even though they'd started the morning literally side by side.
The whole point of their plan had been privacy, no interference, no witnesses, and now here they were, each one fading away separately, with nobody around to notice and absolutely nobody to help. By early afternoon, all four men were suffering from severe heat illness, with many of the symptoms later believed by investigators to be consistent with heat stroke, and none of them was capable of making sound decisions anymore. Basic movement had become incredibly difficult. Distances that should have taken just minutes to cover stretched out far longer than that. Their remaining water disappeared completely. The videos from this point on are fragmented and confusing, with large gaps appearing between recordings. None of them fully acknowledged just how severe the situation had become. All of them kept holding on to the belief that they could recover after resting just a little bit longer. None of them did. When Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias didn't come home that night, their families eventually reported them missing. Search teams started retracing likely routes through the park, but the investigation initially had to consider several possible paths. Since none of the families had any idea about the wager or the specific challenge the four men had actually planned, all they'd been told was that it was a simple sightseeing trip. Searchers eventually located all four men, scattered miles apart from each other, exactly where their decision to split up had left them. They were dead for multiple hours already. Their phones held dozens of short video clips, interrupted recordings, GPS data, and timestamps documenting that slow slide from confidence at sunrise to confusion by the afternoon. Using GPS data, the abandoned gear scattered along the trail, timestamps from the videos, and the footage itself, investigators were able to reconstruct large portions of the day's events, although significant gaps remained where no recordings existed and none of the men were present to explain exactly what happened. What that footage ultimately revealed is that none of them died because of one single mistake. They spent hours making increasingly poor decisions while their judgment slowly broke down in the extreme heat. One small bad call after another, until there was nothing left to fall back on. A challenge that started as a test of who had more endurance ended up becoming something much darker, a demonstration of just how fast even four genuinely fit, capable guys can lose the ability to recognize danger once heat illness really takes hold.
And that, to me, is the whole reason this story has stuck. It wasn't recklessness in one big dramatic moment. It was recklessness built quietly, decision by decision, until there was no way out left.
It was July 10th, 2015. Surprise Canyon in Death Valley National Park was a narrow, rock-walled drainage where confined terrain and extreme heat quickly intensified conditions. Sunlight reflected off canyon walls, limiting shade to brief, shifting pockets. Jaxian Dubois, 38, was a Colorado-based outdoor content creator running a gear testing channel focused on field performance under extreme conditions. His collaborator, Nadia Mbeki, 35, was a photographer assisting with documentation, with limited formal wilderness experience but strong general fitness. The expedition was structured as a sponsored product evaluation of heat-adaptive outdoor equipment, with deliverables tied to documented real-world performance and field footage expected for post-production review. Prior to the trip, Jaxian tested a cooling vest, hydration system, solar charger, and lightweight footwear under controlled conditions with limited environmental stress, reinforcing confidence in their reliability. However, those tests did not replicate sustained exposure in a confined desert canyon, where radiant heat from rock surfaces, ground temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Fahrenheit in exposed sections, and restricted airflow sharply increased physiological strain over time. My impression here is that the testing setup and the actual environment just feel like two completely different worlds. The pair entered Surprise Canyon early in the morning with a 2-day water supply intended for moderate exertion and planned filming stops. Initial progress was steady with intermittent shade, but rising sun quickly intensified heat as canyon walls began reflecting radiation into the narrow corridor, creating sustained exposure even in partially shaded sections. By mid-morning, the cooling vests start to lose effectiveness. The phase change material inside them is basically spent, so at that point it's just a slight surface cooling effect, nothing that actually helps with the core body heat anymore. They're sweating heavily too, both of them, and that's speeding up dehydration fast. On top of that, the terrain keeps forcing constant effort, uneven ground, short climbs, all within the canyon floor, so there's really no chance to settle or recover. A solar charger they set up around midday also doesn't hold up well. The extreme heat causes it to overheat and shut down intermittently. So instead of steady power, it only gives short, unreliable bursts of charging. By early afternoon, they reach a planned rest point. Water is already running low, and early signs of dehydration are showing headache, fatigue, slower thinking. But at the time, it still just feels like normal exertion, not something that calls for turning back. It reads to me like things are starting to feel routine even while they aren't. They decide to push on to an upper canyon section for more documentation anyway, staying out through the peak heat window when the sun's radiation is at its strongest. On the way back, things start to fall apart faster. The heat stress and dehydration don't level off, they stack. Then one more issue hits. Jaxian's footwear starts breaking down. The adhesive softens in the heat and the sole begins to separate, which makes movement unstable. Every step takes more effort, slower, and more careful, right when fluid levels are already critically low. Shortly afterward, both individuals exhausted their remaining water supplies. Nadia developed acute gastrointestinal distress alongside worsening heat illness, forcing repeated stops in minimal available shade. Cognitive function declined in both individuals, with impaired decision-making, reduced situational awareness, and slowed response to environmental cues. Communication systems initially failed due to lack of signal within the canyon and device limitations under thermal stress. As conditions deteriorated, Nadia managed to reach a higher ridgeline and briefly establish emergency contact, transmitting location data and initiating a rescue response before her condition worsened further. Me seeing her having to climb just to get signal really highlights how a location alone can control whether help is even possible. While awaiting rescue, Jaxian's condition rapidly progressed from heat exhaustion to severe heat stroke. He became disoriented, unable to maintain coherent speech, and lost the ability to regulate body temperature. Core physiological collapse followed sustained hyperthermia and dehydration. Rescue teams arrived after several hours via coordinated ground and aerial deployment. Nadia was located first in critical condition and evacuated, while Jaxian was found shortly after in a lower drainage segment, unresponsive, with signs consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling efforts and emergency transport, both individuals' conditions had progressed beyond recovery. Jaxian was pronounced dead shortly after evacuation due to hyperthermia and multi-organ failure from prolonged exposure, exertion, and dehydration. Nadia also succumbed to severe heat stroke and organ failure during emergency treatment at a medical facility. In the aftermath, investigators identified multiple contributing factors, including reliance on controlled condition equipment testing, underestimation of radiant heat amplification within confined canyon geometry, continued exertion during early physiological decline, and delayed emergency activation due to communication constraints. The incident was later cited in outdoor safety analyses as a case demonstrating how gear performance claims and controlled testing environments cannot substitute for real-world thermal load assessment in extreme desert terrain. It was July 14, 2018, in Furnace Creek, Death Valley National Park, under an active excessive heat warning with extreme triple-digit temperatures. A silver-gray 2014 Honda Civic arrived at a visitor parking area despite the dangerous conditions. The two young women who got out of the car were really just focused on making content like that was basically the whole mindset at that moment. Kayla Renee Durst, 22, was from the Phoenix area. She grew up around extreme heat and kind of assumed that meant she could handle it better than most people. She didn't finish community college and was working part-time at a beauty counter in Tempe while also trying to grow her TikTok, which was mostly centered on desert aesthetics and lifestyle content. By mid-2018, she had a small but growing audience and a pretty clear direction for what she wanted to post more about visuals and trends than anything outdoors related. Her focus was really on content creation, not hiking or anything technical. She had been to a few popular spots in Arizona and the Grand Canyon, but only the easy paved viewpoints. She didn't really have backcountry experience, and she wasn't carrying proper hiking gear either, just basic stuff like lightweight athletic sandals that weren't made for rough desert terrain. Brianna Solano, 21, was her roommate and someone she often worked with on content. She had tried nursing school for a bit, but left before finishing. Compared to Kayla, she was a bit more cautious, but she usually just went along with whatever plans Kayla came up with when it came to trips or shoots. Her social media wasn't as big, and most of their content together ended up being posted through Kayla's account or shared collaborations. The trip to Death Valley was Kayla's idea. It came out of the growing attention around desert travel content online at the time. She had looked up locations and inspiration beforehand, mostly focusing on places that would look good on camera and fit current TikTok trends. At the end of the day, the trip was really about getting striking visuals in a place that was starting to get popular online, not about hiking experience or understanding the risks involved.
I don't really see this as some dramatic thing, like they ignored everything in the moment. It feels more like they were just locked into one goal and didn't really pause to question if the place actually fit what they were trying to do. And honestly, I've seen that pattern before. Once everything starts through the camera, the environment stops being the main focus and just becomes the backdrop.
In Midsummer Death Valley, the valley floor sits in conditions where heat stops feeling like weather and starts acting like constant load. The basin's geography amplifies the effect. Mountain ranges trap heat, elevations sit below sea level, and the exposed desert surface offers no meaningful shade or cooling relief. A visitor center in Furnace Creek displays live temperatures and safety advisories, and rangers regularly warn visitors about outdoor exposure in peak summer. Those warnings were there, but they weren't really processed at the moment. What made the conditions easier to underestimate wasn't really a lack of information, it was more how people processed it in the moment. Death Valley actually has pretty clear warnings, but they're the kind you see on signs, boards, or advisories that just stay the same no matter what you're doing. So for visitors who are basically treating the place like a quick stop for photos rather than something physically demanding, those warnings tend to fade into the background.
And from my perspective, that's really where the misread happens. You see the signs, you hear the advisories, but they don't quite land as urgent or personal at the moment.
It ends up feeling like general information sitting there in the background, not something that's actively registering as personal or immediate. The gap between dangerous conditions exists, and this activity is unsafe right now is where misjudgment typically forms, especially when the planned activity is framed as a short, accessible walk rather than sustained exposure. Instead, shortly after arriving, they documented the environment on their phones, treating the extreme heat and temperature displays as part of the visual experience rather than a safety concern. They also retrieved a paper park map from a public display rack and used it to select a nearby geological feature as their destination. The selection process itself did not involve a reassessment of environmental conditions. The trail choice was based on proximity and visual interest rather than seasonal suitability or heat load. On park maps, short-distance trails in Death Valley can appear comparable to casual walking routes elsewhere, with little visual distinction between a mild-season hike and a midsummer exposure route. Without direct consultation with rangers or updated field guidance, the decision remained anchored in distance and aesthetics rather than thermal risk, reinforcing the assumption that the hike would be brief and manageable. The route they picked was shown on the map as a short, easy hike, nothing that really stood out as risky. There wasn't much mention of how different it gets in summer or how serious the heat can be. With the car's air conditioning still running, they left the parking area and just drove south along the main park road toward the trailhead, heading deeper into the valley as the temperature outside was already climbing to dangerous levels. Badwater Road runs south along the floor of Death Valley between two mountain ranges, through a landscape that is exposed, reflective, and intensely heat-retaining in midsummer. The paved road remains accessible to visitors, but the surrounding desert offers little to no relief from direct solar exposure or radiating ground heat. They traveled south with the air conditioning running and arrived at a small gravel trailhead parking area marked for a short canyon hike. One other vehicle was present, but the lot was otherwise empty. The trail begins directly from the pullout and leads into a shallow canyon with a compacted gravel surface and scattered rock. There is no meaningful shade at the start, and canyon walls remain low for some distance before offering any real cover. In mid-morning summer conditions, the air temperature was already well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with ground surfaces significantly hotter in exposed sections. They got out of the car and pretty much started filming right away, short walking clips, wide shots of the canyon, that kind of thing. And honestly, the phones sort of ended up running the whole pace of the hike. They decided when to stop, when to start moving again, and even how they moved through each section of the trail based on what would look good on camera. They had a small shared bottle of water, about a liter total, and early on they just kind of passed it back and forth like it was enough for a quick walk.
I'm gonna be honest here, that already says a lot about how the situation was framed in their minds. More like a short content stop than something physically demanding.
There wasn't much extra gear in the car either. What they had on them was basically it. They were dressed for warm weather, not for desert conditions. So light clothing, minimal footwear, and not much protection from the ground heating up underneath them. A portable charger was left behind in the vehicle, which again shows where the focus was at the time. It wasn't really on staying out there for long or preparing for changing conditions. The phones were already in hand before they fully left the vehicle and remained active throughout the walk. They were used continuously lifted, lowered, and repositioned, shaping, pacing, and framing as they moved through the canyon. The pattern that developed was not steady hiking, but repeated stopping, adjusting angles, and recording short segments before continuing forward. Nothing in what they brought or how it was used accounted for sustained exposure to extreme heat. The focus remained on capturing the environment as it appeared, not on mitigating the conditions it created. About 15 minutes into the hike, they met the only other people they would see on the trail that day. A retired couple from Nevada, experienced desert hikers, were heading back toward the trailhead. They later told investigators they immediately noticed Kayla and Brianna were moving slowly, frequently stopping, and already showing clear signs of strain in the heat. The girls were also pausing along the trail to film short clips, repositioning themselves, adjusting angles, and capturing moments of the canyon rather than maintaining a steady hiking pace. After a brief exchange about the conditions, the couple continued on and left the trail shortly after, seeing no one else on their way out. Experienced hikers note this aligns with early-stage heat strain rather than immediate collapse. Early indicators are often subtle, including reduced walking pace, unnecessary pauses, and slower responses to conversation. These signs can appear while the person still feels cognitively normal. In the initial phase, heat stress may not be perceived as distress, increasing the risk of continued exposure instead of retreat. Their pauses started getting longer once they reached the more exposed sections of trail, and instead of steady hiking, it shifted into a stop-and-go rhythm. By the time they got to the natural bridge formation, that pattern had already fully taken over. The canyon narrowed there and offered some shade, but not enough to really take the edge off the exposure. The rock walls had been absorbing heat for days, and were still pushing it back into the narrow space, so even though the light softened, the air didn't actually feel any cooler. Kayla stayed at the bridge for a while longer, filming in a more deliberate, structured way, instead of just moving through it. The phone remained in use throughout, shifting between wide shots, close framing, and views through the arch, with no interruption for rest or reassessment. Brianna was present throughout, sometimes in front of the camera, and sometimes operating it herself, continuing to document rather than pausing.
I keep thinking about that couple's reaction here. They didn't overthink it, they didn't dramatize it, they just looked back at what was in front of them and quietly made the call to leave. In a place like this, that kind of simple judgment actually matters more than people realize.
During this time, Brianna finished the remaining water in her bottle. Once it was empty, there was no opportunity to refill it, as the trail offered no water sources at any point. By the time they left the bridge and continued deeper into the canyon, their total remaining water supply was minimal, and they were moving further into sustained exposure with no shade, no hydration source, and no indication that conditions were improving. The maintained trail ends at the bridge, marked by a sign indicating that anything beyond it is unmaintained canyon terrain. The canyon continues regardless, narrowing, deepening, and becoming more enclosed as the walls rise and the footing grows looser and less defined. There is no physical barrier preventing further movement, only the absence of maintenance and guidance. Beyond the bridge, the environment creates a misleading shift in perception. The higher canyon walls reduce direct overhead sun in places, and the enclosed space can feel marginally cooler at first exposure. But the thermal conditions do not actually improve. The rock faces continue to radiate stored heat, and the reduced airflow inside the canyon limits any real dissipation.
I've seen this kind of shift before in environments like this, the moment where reduced sunlight gets mistaken for reduced danger. But the heat doesn't actually ease up, it just changes how it's delivered.
The result is not relief, but a different form of sustained heat load, less direct, more trapped. Brianna continued past the sign behind Kayla. She followed the same pattern she had been in since the start. Kayla moved first, framed the moment, and set the direction. Brianna adjusted, supported, and often occupied the frame herself. Decisions about where to go and what to capture were effectively made through Kayla's movement and pacing, and Brianna's role remained responsive rather than leading. As they moved deeper, the behavior that had started as casual documenting became more continuous. Stops were no longer just pauses for rest, but repeated moments of repositioning, changing angles, redoing shots, adjusting framing, and reattempting short clips as the canyon kept changing visually around them. Movement and filming started to overlap until there was barely any separation between traveling and producing content. They eventually progressed several hundred meters beyond the maintained section before stopping for an extended period. By that point, their movement had slowed significantly, and the rhythm of hiking had been replaced almost entirely by intermittent filming and short pauses that grew longer each time they stopped. At some point in this stretch, Brianna lowered herself onto a flat rock surface and did not immediately stand again. At this stage, physiological strain typically transitions from performance degradation to system-level failure progression. The distinction between fatigue and heat injury becomes increasingly blurred from an external perspective, as both present as slowed movement and prolonged rest. However, in extreme environmental heat, rest does not function as recovery. The absence of cooling mechanisms means that metabolic heat continues to accumulate even during inactivity, particularly when surrounding surfaces remain hot enough to radiate energy back into the body. She remained out of active motion while Kayla continued further ahead, still filming portions of the canyon walls and looking deeper into the narrowing terrain. By this point, their responses to the heat were no longer unfolding in exactly the same way. Brianna appeared to be slowing first, spending longer periods stationary, and no longer matching Kayla's movement through the canyon. Kayla, meanwhile, continued pushing forward despite showing signs of impairment herself.
That's something I find particularly unsettling about severe heat illness. It doesn't always stop people immediately. A person can still be moving and making decisions while their ability to judge the situation is quietly and slowly getting worse.
Whatever was happening between them at that point, the available evidence suggests they did not leave the area together. The human body keeps its core temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it mainly relies on sweating and evaporation to cool itself down. Under normal conditions, that system works pretty well because the air around you is usually cooler than your skin, so heat can actually move away from the body. But in places where the air temperature goes above skin temperature, which can happen pretty regularly in Death Valley during peak summer, that whole balance flips. Instead of releasing heat, the body starts to take it in from the environment. Sweating still happens, but whether it actually helps depends completely on how fast that moisture can evaporate.
I usually think of it as the point where the body's cooling system is still trying to do its job, but the environment isn't really cooperating anymore.
In extreme desert heat, sweat evaporates rapidly, accelerating dehydration without providing meaningful cooling. As fluid levels drop, sweat production diminishes, and the body's ability to regulate temperature collapses further. Once that process begins, core temperature can rise quickly, and heat illness can progress into heat stroke in a relatively short period under sustained exposure. The progression of heat illness in conditions like this usually isn't something a person notices right away. Early on, it shows up in small ways: slower movement, more frequent stops, and kind of a narrowing of focus that's easy to miss in the moment. Thinking doesn't just stop, but it starts to feel less flexible without you really realizing it. So even when it would still be possible to slow down, turn back, or look for shade, that adjustment often doesn't happen simply because the impairment hasn't fully registered yet. Based on the reconstruction of phone data, movement patterns, and final known positions, Kayla and Brianna likely began attempting to return toward the trailhead after an extended period beyond the maintained trail. By that point, they had only a minimal amount of water remaining between them and were still several tenths of a mile from the car. Ambient temperatures were near their peak, and the ground surface remained intensely hot under direct sun. Their movement back was slower and less continuous than their initial ascent, marked by reduced pacing and longer pauses between stretches of walking. Between the bridge and the trailhead, the environment stays completely exposed the entire way back. The return walk from roughly 0.85 miles out would normally take a healthy adult about 15 to 20 minutes on relatively even ground, but the natural bridge trail is not even terrain. It is loose gravel, scattered rock, and uneven transitions in elevation that are manageable at baseline but become increasingly significant under physiological strain. As heat illness progresses, the problem is no longer just endurance, it becomes coordination. Foot placement becomes less precise. Small changes in grade require more effort than the body can reliably produce. What would normally be minor adjustments turn into repeated interruptions in movement. In extreme heat, the body is failing to cool itself, and it may gradually lose the cognitive and motor control needed to correct for that failure. Sweating likely began to diminish significantly during this return phase. Once sweat production drops off in sustained high heat, it is not a sign of recovery, it is a sign that the system is no longer able to regulate temperature. From that point, core temperature rises without a meaningful counterbalance. The environment offered no mitigation. Between the bridge and the trailhead, there is no water, no shade, and no shelter, and during that entire window, no other hikers entered the trail. The parking area remained quiet, and the vehicle they arrived in stayed in place, unattended and unremarked upon for hours.
What always sticks with me here is how normal everything would still look from the outside. An empty trail, a parked car, and no obvious sign that anything inside that stretch was going wrong.
At that point, the body is no longer regulating temperature in a reliable way, and performance starts breaking down in uneven stages rather than all at once. Early signs may have included slowed movement, intermittent pauses, and reduced awareness of pace and direction. In this state, decision-making often becomes unreliable, and the distinction between rest and continuation begins to blur. At a certain point in this progression, movement typically becomes inconsistent, short bursts of walking, followed by longer periods of stillness. Whether they experienced any final sustained attempt to continue is unknown. What is documented is where their movement ultimately ceased. The afternoon in Death Valley continued in the same sustained, unbroken heat that defines midsummer in the basin. Air temperatures peaked near 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the surrounding area, and the exposed valley floor held even higher surface heat where sunlight struck directly. With no cloud cover and minimal wind, there was little variation in conditions, only continuous, radiating heat held between the mountains. No hikers came onto the Natural Bridge Trail during that stretch, so the canyon just kind of stayed the same, quiet, still, and untouched. The trail, the rock around it, even the parking area didn't really change at all. The silver Civic was still sitting in the pullout the whole time, exactly where they left it, untouched and unattended. At that point in the afternoon, conditions in the valley had begun to ease only in the most technical sense. The air temperature had dropped slightly from its peak, but the environment remained dangerously hot by any standard, with surfaces still retaining and radiating heat from hours of full sun exposure. The canyon system itself held that heat longer, its rock walls acting as slow-releasing thermal mass even as direct solar intensity began to soften.
Personally, I don't put much weight on the fact that the peak temperature has passed. Everything around them was still hot, and that's what mattered.
The camera kept being used, but less frequently, with longer gaps between recordings and more time spent stationary. The last recorded moments captured only fragments of the canyon, brief, unsteady clips of rock, light, and movement through tight space, before the pattern of filming stopped altogether. After that point, there was no further documented activity from either of them that day. By the final segment of their movement through the canyon, coordination between pace and decision-making had likely become inconsistent. Movement patterns in this phase of heat illness often shift away from continuous travel into fragmented intervals, short periods of walking, interrupted by longer stops that are no longer strictly voluntary recovery points, but responses to physical limitation. In such a state, group synchronization also tends to break down, with individuals no longer maintaining shared pacing or mutual awareness in a reliable way. The family from southern Utah came onto the trail pretty calmly, like it was just another short walk they'd done before. Nothing about it really felt urgent to them at the time. The route was short, familiar, and the kind of thing they'd normally be able to handle without thinking too much about it. They only went a little ways in before the father stopped. Something up ahead caught his attention and kind of broke that steady rhythm of walking. He went forward on his own to take a closer look, then almost immediately turned back and told the rest of the family to stay put right there. Kayla Renee Durst was found on the trail, unresponsive and face down, approximately within sight of the trailhead. She was no longer in motion and showed no visible signs of responsiveness. One hand was extended forward, still loosely holding a phone that had likely entered thermal shutdown. Her footwear showed signs of extreme thermal stress, consistent with prolonged contact with hot ground, including partial separation of the sole from the sandal structure. This type of failure is conditional, resulting from the combination of extreme ground temperatures, the abrasive nature of the canyon gravel, and the material stress of repeated foot strikes under physiological strain. She had no visible supplies remaining. The family withdrew immediately without going deeper into the canyon, unaware another person had entered the area with Kayla. They returned to the parking lot and contacted emergency services after initial signal instability, reporting an unresponsive individual on the trail. They remained at the trailhead as instructed while awaiting responders.
I keep thinking about that moment with the father. The fact that he didn't try to explain it or even process it out loud with them. He just saw enough in those few seconds and made the call to stop everything.
Furnace Creek Rangers arrived later that afternoon, followed by County EMS. A staged entry protocol was used due to extreme heat conditions before a team proceeded on foot into the canyon. Kayla was located first approximately 800 feet from the trailhead and was declared deceased shortly after assessment. Search personnel later located Brianna Solano deeper along the route near a natural bridge formation in a collapsed seated position beside an empty water container. Both individuals showed no signs of trauma or animal involvement, only severe heat-related injury consistent with hyperthermia. Both individuals were confirmed deceased at the scene, with investigators determining that death had occurred hours before discovery. Both deaths were classified as environmental hyperthermia caused by extreme heat exposure. Autopsies confirmed no underlying medical conditions and negative toxicology. Investigators concluded contributing factors included inadequate water, unsuitable footwear for ground temperatures, lack of shade, and insufficient environmental preparation. The canyon remained open afterward under continued heat advisories, with officials emphasizing the outcome as the result of cumulative environmental and behavioral factors leading to rapid physiological collapse under extreme desert heat. The medical examiner's autopsies confirmed hyperthermia as the cause of death in both individuals. Park authorities' review and incident reconstruction aligned with these findings, and the case was formally closed as an environmental heat-related fatality with no enforcement actions taken. It was April 14th, 2023. A remote section of Death Valley National Park formed a network of canyons, dry washes, and broken ridgelines where navigation errors could quickly lead to isolation. The terrain included narrow limestone cuts, unstable talus slopes, and dry drainages with seasonal or unreliable water sources. Jonah Okoye, 34, was a Texas-based content creator running a channel testing new tech in real-world settings. He was especially focused on AI tools, basically seeing if they could actually handle planning trips, not just generate them on paper. For this project, he used an AI travel assistant to build a full wilderness route with almost no input from him.
I keep noticing how easy it's become to treat AI output like it's already been checked for facts, even when it hasn't.
A few days before the trip, he accepts an AI-generated Death Valley route with canyons, a mapped water source, and a ridge connection, treating it as a controlled test without really adjusting or questioning it. The plan looked structured but had major issues that weren't caught before departure. A seasonally dry water source, altered routes from erosion and flash flooding, underestimated hydration needs, and a ridge section requiring technical talus movement. None of it was independently verified. A park ranger briefly warned him that water in the area was uncertain, but he proceeded anyway. He entered the backcountry with limited water, standard gear, and no emergency communication device. Once past the trailhead, cell service dropped as he moved deeper into the canyon system under rising temperatures.
I've seen that moment before where the connection just disappears and you're fully on your own after that point.
Early progress through the drainage network was steady, though an unexpected washout forced an unplanned detour across unstable debris fields. The added distance and physical effort increased exertion beyond initial projections. By late morning, as ambient temperatures climbed and solar exposure intensified, his rate of hydration consumption increased significantly. As the terrain opened into exposed sections of sand and fractured rock, heat reflected upward from pale surfaces, compounding thermal strain. Fatigue began to accumulate, and rest intervals became more frequent. Despite these signs, Jonah continued along the planned route, relying on the assumption that the next waypoint would provide relief and replenishment. At the mapped water source, Jonah found only a dry basin, as the AI had incorrectly assumed seasonal flow. With no nearby alternatives and reduced reserves, he documented the failure on camera but continued the route, prioritizing completion of the experiment over retreat. Overnight conditions allowed limited recovery, but the next segment proved more severe than expected. The ridge connection required sustained climbing over unstable talus and fractured rock, increasing exertion and fluid loss at a critical stage. During the ascent, he slipped and struck his knee on exposed stone, significantly reducing mobility. From that point, both ascent and descent became hazardous due to injury, fatigue, and unstable terrain. His remaining water soon ran out, and he became increasingly disoriented with no reliable communication. He recorded a short video describing his condition before attempting a descent, but progress was slow and limited by injury and exhaustion. Concern was raised when he failed to return on schedule and his vehicle remained at the trailhead, prompting a search operation across the canyon network with ground teams and aerial reconnaissance deployed.
That short recording ends up being the only thing I have to go on once everything else goes quiet.
He was eventually located in a lower drainage zone, conscious but severely dehydrated, with a swollen knee and limited mobility. His condition was critical, with signs of advanced heat illness compounded by prolonged exposure and fluid loss. Although ground teams reached him and began assisted movement out of the canyon, his condition deteriorated rapidly during extraction. The combination of severe dehydration, exertional heat stress, and inability to stabilize his body temperature led to collapse before evacuation could be completed. He was pronounced dead shortly after being transferred to a ranger-accessible point, with medical assessments citing hyperthermia and multi-organ failure consistent with prolonged heat exposure and exertion under dehydration. The incident was later classified as a high-risk backcountry fatality, driven by reliance on unverified algorithmic route planning, compounded by inaccurate environmental assumptions, insufficient emergency preparedness, and delayed effective response once incapacitation occurred. Officials emphasized that digital navigation tools cannot replace field verification in remote desert environments where conditions can shift rapidly. This happened back in September 12th of 2017, up on Half Dome in Yosemite National Park, and it involved 3 wealthy lifestyle influencers from Los Angeles who flew in for what they thought was going to be a luxury adventure content trip. They had followings built on fashion, travel, and wellness, and they came to Yosemite with one goal in mind: get the perfect sunset photo from the top of Half Dome. That was it. That was the whole plan.
Before I get into who these women were, I think it helps to understand exactly what Half Dome actually is.
A lot of people who have never been to Yosemite picture it as just another scenic walk. Well, it's not that. Half Dome rises about 8,800 feet above sea level, and the hike to the top and back covers somewhere between 14 and 16 miles, depending on which trailhead you start from. The last 400 feet of that climb is the part everyone talks about, the cable section, where 2 steel cables run straight up a slab of smooth granite at an angle steep enough that you are essentially pulling your own body weight up using your arms and shoulders. Wooden boards are bolted in at intervals so people can pause and catch their breath, but there is nothing soft about that climb. The rangers who worked that day later admitted that they got a bad feeling almost the second these 3 showed up at the trailhead. Not because they looked unfit or unprepared in an obvious way, but because nothing about their approach matched what Half Dome actually demands.
And look, here's the thing that bothers me about a 400-foot wall of granite with steel cables bolted into it. It doesn't care who you are or how many followers you have.
It treats a movie star and a first-time tourist exactly the same way. That should have been obvious to anyone planning a trip there, and somehow it was not obvious to 3 people who built entire careers on planning trips.
I've looked into a handful of other Half Dome cable incidents while researching this episode,
and one detail comes up again and again in the official guidance the park puts out every single season. Rangers specifically tell visitors not to attempt the cables if there is any chance they will still be up there after the sun goes down, because the route has no lighting, no rescue access in the dark, and almost no margin for a single misstep. That warning is printed on signs at the trailhead, repeated by rangers stationed along the route, and posted on the park's own website months before anyone even books a flight. None of that information is hidden or hard to find. These 3 simply never went looking for it. Kaya Park, 26, was a luxury travel influencer known for prioritizing visually impressive content over practical planning. Coming from a wealthy background, she had a reputation for taking risks to get unique photos. She had spent months planning a specific Half Dome sunset photo, studying other summit images, and carefully preparing her outfit and lighting for the shot.
That detail about studying other people's photos for 6 months tells you that she spent more time planning the aesthetics of this shot than she spent actually learning anything about the mountain itself.
6 months of Pinterest boards and 0 minutes reading a single Park Service safety bulletin. That is not a small gap in preparation. That is the entire preparation missing. It also tells you something about how Kaya approached risk in general, not just on this trip. People who knew her described a pattern where she would scout a location entirely through other people's photos, and then assume that if someone else got the shot safely, she could too, without asking what conditions that other person was hiking in, what time they started, or what gear they were carrying. Copying someone's finished photo is not the same as copying their planning, and that distinction seems to have been completely lost on her going into this trip. The second woman was 25 years old Noah Rosen. She was a fitness and wellness influencer, the type who posted constantly about discipline, endurance, and mental toughness. She had done plenty of difficult workouts and short hikes, and she genuinely believed that being physically fit could get you through almost any outdoor challenge.
The problem I found was that she had basically no experience with long alpine-style climbs, the kind where conditions change fast and the terrain doesn't care how strong your legs are.
Throughout this whole ordeal, Noah became the group's main voice of confidence whenever anyone raised a concern, and that confidence ended up being incredibly dangerous.
What gets me about Noah specifically is the mismatch between her brand and her actual skill set.
Kaya's entire brand was built around pushing through discomfort and refusing to quit. That mindset works in a controlled gym environment, but it does not necessarily apply to a mountain. She repeatedly dismissed warnings during the climb, suggesting she viewed every obstacle as something that could be overcome through determination, rather than recognizing that some risks require caution instead of persistence. The third woman was 24-year-old Catalina. She was a fashion and lifestyle influencer focused on luxury brands and curated travel photography. Out of the three of them, she had the least hiking experience by far, and she leaned heavily on Kaya and Noah whenever a decision needed to be made outdoors.
From what I understand, she agreed to the Half Dome climb mostly because the summit shot just fit the visual style she wanted for her page. She wasn't someone who wanted to be there for the challenge, she wanted to be there for the content. Of the three women, Catalina is the one I keep thinking about differently than the other two.
She was not the one pushing for the climb, and she was not the one arguing with rangers. She just trusted that the other two had this handled because they sounded so sure of themselves all day.
I think that's the most relatable mistake in this entire story.
Most of us have been the third person in a group, the one who goes along because everyone else seems confident, and most of the time that works out fine. This time it did not, and that gap between most of the time and this time is exactly what makes outdoor accidents so brutal. Catalina had the least outdoor experience in the group, leaving her with no real basis to judge whether the other's confidence was informed or reckless. Unlike Kaya and Noah, she couldn't distinguish between genuine expertise and misplaced assurance driven by social media goals. By the time she might have realized the difference, it was already too late. They arrived at the trailhead much later than recommended. Rangers notice immediately that their schedule makes little sense, because most people attempting Half Dome start before sunrise. These three did not start until late morning. A ranger at the base told them directly that they were starting dangerously late, that they should expect to be descending long before sunset, and that Half Dome simply was not a sunset destination for hikers without serious experience. The women laughed and explained that they were used to extreme travel. One ranger later recalled that this was the exact moment he realized these three did not understand where they actually were. A late morning start on a 14-mile round trip is not a small scheduling error. It is close to giving away half the daylight before you have taken a single step.
And the laugh is the part I can't get past. You can forgive someone for not knowing the mileage or the elevation gain off the top of their head.
It is much harder to forgive someone for being told directly by a trained ranger that their plan is dangerous and responding with a laugh instead of a single follow-up question.
I think about what a single follow-up question would have actually cost them at that moment.
Something as simple as asking how many hours the round trip typically takes, or whether other hikers ever attempt a sunset summit and what happens to them on the way down. That question takes 10 seconds to ask and could have completely changed the rest of the day. Instead, they treated a direct safety warning from a uniformed professional the same way they might treat an unsolicited comment from a stranger online, something to brush past rather than something to actually weigh. When the rangers later went through what these women actually packed, it painted a pretty clear picture of where their priorities were. They brought multiple outfit changes, several pounds of camera gear, tripods, cosmetic bags, portable lighting equipment, and battery packs for all of it. What they left behind was almost unbelievable. No headlamps, not enough water for a hike of that length, no emergency layers for when the temperature drops at elevation once the sun goes down, no backup batteries for actual navigation equipment, just for their cameras and lights. They apparently assumed their smartphone flashlights would be enough to get them down a vertical granite face in total darkness if it came to that. A headlamp costs about $20 and weighs next to nothing. An extra liter of water adds maybe 2 pounds to a pack that already had several pounds of camera equipment stuffed into it. So this was not a weight problem, and it was not a cost problem. This was three women deciding, without ever saying it out loud, that the equipment for capturing the moment mattered more than the equipment for surviving it. That is the single packing list detail that tells you everything about how this day was framed before it even started.
I went back and forth on whether to call this an oversight or a decision, because oversight makes it sound accidental, like nobody thought about it.
But three separate people packed three separate bags for this trip, and not one of them flagged a headlamp as worth bringing, while all three somehow agreed that portable lighting rigs for video were essential. That is not an accident. That tells you what each of them, independently, considered a priority for this day, and survival gear simply did not make the list. The hike becomes a content production day instead of a climb. Every major viewpoint becomes a photo shoot, an outfit change, video shoots for social media, multiple retakes. At Vernal Fall, they stopped for 45 minutes. At Nevada Fall, nearly an hour. At Little Yosemite Valley, another extended break for sponsored content. By mid-afternoon, they were already behind schedule. Add that up with me for a second. 45 minutes, then close to 60, then another extended stop on top of that. That is somewhere around 2.5 hours burned on photography alone before they even reach the halfway point of the climb, and none of that includes the actual walking time. A normal round trip for an early starting, steady hiker takes somewhere between 10 and 12 hours total. These three spent almost a quarter of that entire budget on tripod angles before they had gone half the distance. And the part that should scare you is that the hardest section, the cables, was still completely ahead of them.
What really gets me is that none of these 3 stops happened at locations where stopping made any logical sense from a safety standpoint.
Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall are beautiful, sure, but they are also exactly the kind of spot where a long pause eats directly into the cushion you need for the summit attempt later. A smart group plans its long stops near the beginning of a trip when there is daylight to spare and keeps things moving once the harder terrain starts. This group did the opposite without seeming to notice, treating every waterfall like it existed in its own bubble with no connection to the hours ticking away on the rest of the route. A backcountry ranger encounters them near Subdome. He notices their pace, their equipment, and the amount of remaining daylight. He strongly recommends turning around immediately, skipping the summit, and returning another day. He explains that sunset photography is not worth descending the cables in darkness. Kaya insists they only need a few pictures. The ranger is unconvinced. A few pictures is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it is worth sitting with for a second. A few pictures implies a quick stop, in and out, nothing that should cost real time. But we already know from Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall that a few pictures for this group meant 45 minutes minimum. Kaya was not lying to the ranger exactly. She was lying to herself about what a few pictures had actually been costing them all day. And that self-deception is a much harder thing to argue someone out of than a simple misunderstanding.
I find it interesting that the ranger near Subdome didn't just repeat the generic safety message every hiker gets at the trailhead.
He looked specifically at their pace and their gear before forming his recommendation, which tells me he was reading the situation in real time rather than just reciting a script. That is a more informed warning than the first one they received, built on actual evidence of how the day had gone so far, and it still did not land any harder than the first warning had. The climb is taking much longer than expected, and signs of trouble emerge. Catalina is exhausted, water supplies are running low, Noah develops leg cramps. Several hikers descending warn them they are cutting it too close. They dismiss every concern. Noah repeatedly says they are almost there, despite the fact that they still have the hardest section ahead. I want to single out the leg cramps specifically, because that is not a vague feeling of being tired. That is your body sending a very concrete signal that it is running low on water and electrolytes. Cramps at altitude on a long climb are the kind of thing a hiking guide would treat as a hard stop, not a minor inconvenience to push through. Noah, the fitness influencer, whose whole brand was built around understanding her own body, either did not recognize what cramping actually meant, or recognized it and decided the summit mattered more anyway. Neither option reflects well on someone whose entire platform is built on physical expertise. And it was not only their own bodies sending warning signs. Hikers who had already summited and were heading back down took the time to stop and tell them directly that they were cutting things too close, which means strangers, with no reason to lie and nothing to gain, were independently reaching the same conclusion as the rangers. When your own cramping legs, your dwindling water supply, and total strangers coming down the mountain are all telling you the same thing at the same time, that is not a single data point you can dismiss. That is 3 unrelated sources of information all converging, and converging warnings like that almost never turn out to be wrong. Noah's repeated line that they were almost there is also worth examining on its own, because almost there can mean wildly different things depending on what is actually left to cover. From where they were standing, the remaining distance was short in terms of feet, but the remaining difficulty was the steepest, most exposed section of the entire route. Measuring how close you are by distance instead of by difficulty is exactly the kind of error that turns a hard day into a fatal one, and it is an error a more experienced alpine hiker would never have made. At the cable section, they stop repeatedly, take photos while climbing, film social media videos, and hold poses while other hikers wait. Several hikers become irritated. One warns them that this is not the place to be messing around. The women continue, and their summit arrival is delayed even further. The cables only fit one direction of traffic comfortably at a time, which means every pose they held was not just slowing themselves down, it was forcing strangers behind them to dangle on a steel cable bolted into granite while waiting for an outfit check. That is the moment in the story where this stops being purely about their own risk tolerance and starts putting other people in an uncomfortable, exposed position against their will.
I don't think the women were trying to be reckless towards strangers. I think that they had simply stopped noticing that other people existed on the route at all.
There is a specific kind of tunnel vision that comes from being on camera, where the people standing just outside the frame stop registering as real obstacles to consider. I imagine that is exactly what happened here. Every pause for a photo probably felt, in the moment, like it was costing 30 seconds, when in reality, each one was forcing a line of strangers to stand still on an exposed cable route with nothing but a steel wire between them and a very long fall. The frustrated hiker who finally spoke up was not being rude. He was pointing out something that should have been obvious from the very first pose. Near the summit, a ranger descending gives what becomes the final warning. He explains that they need to leave almost immediately, that darkness comes quickly, the granite becomes difficult to navigate, and temperatures are dropping. He tells them plainly that staying for sunset is going to create a serious problem getting down. They assure him they will leave soon. 3 rangers, 3 separate locations along the route, 3 independent warnings, all saying some version of the same thing without ever coordinating with each other. That consistency is the part I keep coming back to. When 3 different professionals who have never spoken to each other that day all reach the identical conclusion within a span of a few hours, that is not caution, that is a pattern being read correctly by everyone except the 3 people it actually applied to. I think it is also worth noticing how the tone of these warnings escalated as the day went on. The first ranger at the trailhead was informative, almost matter-of-fact. The second one near Subdome was firmer, specifically recommending they turn around. By the time the third ranger caught them near the summit, he was described as unusually direct, going out of his way to spell out exactly what kind of problem they would face. That escalation is not rangers becoming more dramatic for no reason. That is professionals adjusting their language in real time because the danger genuinely kept increasing with every hour that passed, and each one of them could see it clearly even from a single brief encounter. Once on top, the summit becomes an outdoor studio. Outfit changes continue, tripods are repositioned dozens of times, hundreds of photos are taken. Video filming consumes even more time. The sun begins dropping, other hikers leave. The summit gradually empties, the women remain.
The summit gradually empties is the detail I would put at the center of this whole episode if I had to pick just one.
Every single other person standing on that rock looked at the same fading light and made the same calculation and walked away. That is not a ranger giving advice that could be dismissed as overly cautious. That is dozens of ordinary strangers, with no authority and nothing to gain from being right, all independently voting with their feet. Watching that happen around you and still staying for more shots is choosing to ignore the clearest, least biased warning available that day. Picture the actual scene for a second. A crowded summit at golden hour, dozens of people taking in the same view, and then slowly, group by group, the crowd starts thinning out as people head for the cables while there is still usable light. By the time the sun is actually setting, the 3 of them are likely standing in a space that used to be packed and is now mostly empty, with maybe a handful of stragglers left. That kind of visual should hit differently than any verbal warning, because it requires no interpretation at all. It is just math playing out in front of your eyes. And somehow, it still was not enough. Sunset arrives. The photographs look incredible. The women celebrate. But now, the trail is almost empty, the cables are below them, and darkness is spreading across the granite. One hiker heading down urges them to follow. They stay behind for just a few more shots. That decision ultimately seals their fate. I keep replaying that phrase, just a few more shots, because by this point in the day, it had already been said in some form at least 4 separate times, at Vernal Fall, at Nevada Fall, on the cables, and now here at the summit with no daylight left to spend. It worked as an excuse every previous time because there had always been enough daylight cushion left to absorb the cost. This was the first time it was said with absolutely no cushion remaining, and nobody in the group seemed to register that the math had finally run out. This is also where I think the hiker who urged them to follow deserves more credit than he probably ever got. He had no obligation to say anything at all. He could have just kept walking down, focused on his own descent, and nobody would have blamed him for it. Instead, he stopped, specifically addressed them, and tried to get them moving while there was still a sliver of usable light left. That is one more independent voice added to a pile of warnings that already included 3 rangers and a thinning summit crowd, and it still was not enough to change their minds. By the time they reach the cables, the sun is gone. Moonlight is limited. Their phones are already losing battery. The granite surface is difficult to see. The steel cables disappear into darkness below. Several descending hikers pass using proper headlamps. The women are struggling to make out the route ahead. Panic begins to replace confidence. Granite holds heat from the sun during the day, and then cools fast once the sun sets, which means condensation can start forming on the surface right around the time these 3 were finally descending, on top of failing phone batteries and 0 headlamps between them. Every single piece of bad luck stacking up in this paragraph traces directly back to a choice made hours earlier. The condensation was always going to happen at that hour. The only variable that changed was whether a hiker was still on the cables when it did, and that variable was entirely in their control. What makes this paragraph so hard to read is that none of these individual problems would have mattered much on their own. Limited moonlight alone is manageable with a headlamp. A dying phone battery alone is manageable if it is not your only light source. Slick granite alone is manageable if you can actually see where your feet are landing. It was the combination of all four happening at once, stacked directly on top of each other, that turned a difficult descent into an impossible one. And every one of those four factors traces back to a decision that could have been made differently earlier in the day. Kaya reaches a congested section of the cables. Attempting to let another climber pass, she steps outside the designated path. Her shoe loses traction on smooth granite. Witnesses hear a scream. She disappears over the edge. Noah instinctively reaches toward her, shifts her weight forward while trying to look over the edge, and loses her grip on the cable. She falls seconds later. Catalina remains frozen on the cables for several minutes, then attempts to descend alone, slips on moisture forming on the cooling granite, and slides off a steep section below the main cable route. I am not going to dramatize this any further than I already have, because 3 people lost their lives within a span of just a few minutes, and that deserves to be treated with weight, rather than turned into a spectacle. What I will say is that almost every factor in this sequence, the darkness, the congestion, the wet granite, the panic, had been predicted out loud by Rangers hours earlier in the day. Rangers launched a search operation overnight, but darkness prevented immediate recovery efforts, and search teams already feared the worst because of where the falls occurred. At first light, all 3 bodies were located below separate sections of the route, and phones containing hundreds of summit photographs were recovered. None contained images of the descent. Several rangers later stated privately that they had expected an accident long before sunset, not because the women were unlucky, but because every warning they received throughout the day had been ignored, and each bad decision pushed them closer to a situation that experienced hikers spend years learning to avoid.
The thing I keep landing on after putting this whole episode together is that nobody failed to warn them.
3 rangers tried, dozens of strangers tried just by leaving when they left, and the math of a fading sunset tried in its own quiet way the entire afternoon. The only thing missing that day was someone inside that group willing to value a warning over a photograph, even just once. It was September 7th, 2018 in Death Valley National Park. A remote stretch of dunes, dry washes, and unmaintained tracks formed an exposed corridor where survival margins narrowed under late summer heat. Pale sand and clay reflected intense heat with little shade or landmarks beyond the road. Kishan Oren was 31, based out of San Diego. He was big into endurance running, the kind of guy who turns long desert runs into content for his audience online. He had experience with distance and training, but Death Valley, especially sustained heat like this, was something he hadn't really tested himself in before. His logistics partner, Brent Messias, 34, helped set things up. Route planning, support setup, and a mid-route water cache to make the attempt possible. A few weeks before the run, Kishan picks a 38-mile Death Valley route after reviewing satellite images and online footage. It looks doable to him, like a solid one-push endurance challenge.
If it were me, I'd be careful how much I trust something like this off satellite images alone. I also start thinking about how much detail doesn't carry over when everything is flattened into a screen view.
He even turns it into a live stream event, with planned water drops along the way. And there's also this underlying pressure trying to prove himself again after earlier criticism that didn't sit right with him. The planning underestimated how quickly Death Valley conditions intensify under direct sun, and how misleading satellite imagery can be in showing elevation and drainage.
I keep thinking about how clean everything looks on a screen compared to how unstable it actually is.
On the morning of the attempt, he began the run on livestream with steady early progress, but as temperatures rose, reflected heat from the pale terrain rapidly increased physical strain. By late morning, Oren's water consumption increased faster than planned, and his pace began to decline. Viewers noted visible strain through the livestream, including longer pauses and reduced clarity in speech. Despite this, he continued forward, emphasizing that stopping would compromise the attempt and the commitment made to his audience. A critical failure occurred at the first scheduled supply point along a desert road crossing. The water cache, intended as a primary hydration resupply, had been placed at an incorrect junction due to a mapping error during setup. When Kishan arrived, the supplies were absent. After an extended search of the area, he was forced to continue with significantly reduced hydration. At this stage, dehydration began accelerating, and early heat illness symptoms emerged, including confusion, impaired judgment, and reduced coordination. Instead of retreating along the road, Kashan committed to continuing the route toward a secondary water source marked on his map, unaware it was unreliable and seasonally dry. By early afternoon, his movement had slowed to a strained walk. Speech became fragmented, and he began showing clear signs of progressing heat stroke. He consumed his remaining water and reached the mapped water source, which was completely dry. At that point, cognitive impairment was already advanced. Although he had emergency communication equipment available, he did not initiate a full distress signal immediately. His judgment was increasingly affected by dehydration, confusion, and a distorted perception of remaining capability, leading him to underestimate the severity of his condition. Instead of calling for evacuation right away, he tries to check himself first. Just a quick self-assessment, trying to figure out how bad things really are. Then he keeps moving a bit, slowly looking for anything shade, a better spot, somewhere he might get a signal or just be able to communicate more clearly. I'm just watching him burn time here, trying small fixes when the bigger problem is already set. But that choice ends up costing time, and in that window, things start to slip even more. His thinking gets less structured, harder to organize, and the delay builds on itself, making it even tougher to respond in a clear, decisive way. As his condition worsened, he struggled to complete basic operational steps under heat stress, including focusing on instructions and maintaining attention long enough to follow through with a full emergency transmission. By the time he attempted to escalate the situation, his cognitive state had already degraded to the point where communication was fragmented and incomplete. The delay meant that when emergency services were finally contacted through a third-party viewer, responders had to rely on limited, indirect location data rather than a precise real-time distress signal. This increased the time required to narrow the search area within the Canyon system. Emergency services were alerted after a viewer contacted authorities during the live stream. Search teams launched immediately, with aerial units deployed once his last known location was confirmed through tracking data. Rescuers found him later that afternoon unconscious, showing signs of severe hyperthermia consistent with advanced heat stroke. Despite rapid cooling and evacuation to a regional hospital, his condition was irreversible, and he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators cited multiple contributing factors, including insufficient hydration planning for Death Valley conditions, a critical navigation error that mispositioned water supplies, and delayed emergency activation. The live stream was also identified as a contributing pressure factor, influencing continued exertion despite clear signs of physiological decline. The recording later circulated widely, prompting renewed scrutiny of endurance challenges in extreme desert environments and the risks of prioritizing performance over survival limits.